In the glittering heart of an empire built on blood and gold, King Adrian Hale committed the oldest sin a powerful man can make. He mistook desire for destiny. While his queen stood silent in the shadows, he handed his crown, his kingdom, and his soul to a woman who smiled like salvation but moved like a snake. They said love made him blind. But this isn't a story about love. This is a story about power, betrayal, and the brutal reckoning that comes when a man chooses fire over foundation. Stay with me until the very end, because what you're about to witness will shatter everything you thought you knew about survival, loyalty, and revenge. If you're watching this, drop a like and comment your city below. Let's build this tribe together. The grand hall of Valadorn's palace stretched like the belly of a golden beast, all marble columns and vaulted ceilings that swallowed sound and spit back echoes. Chandeliers dripped light across polished floors where the kingdom's wealthiest nobles gathered like wolves dressed in silk. Tonight was the Harvest Gala, the crown's annual display of dominance, where loyalty was purchased with wine and promises were traded like currency. Queen Evelyn Carter stood near the eastern balcony, her hands folded against the deep emerald silk of her gown. She wasn't beautiful in the way men wrote poems about. Her beauty was the kind that required attention, the slow-burning type that revealed itself in the angle of her jaw, the steadiness of her gaze, the way her spine never bent even when the weight of the crown pressed down like iron. 34 years old, and she'd spent 12 of them as queen. 12 years of state dinners and treaty negotiations and standing beside a man who used to look at her like she was the only fixed point in a spinning world. She watched him now across the hall. King Adrian Hale moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of someone who'd never been told no. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair starting to silver at the temples, and a jawline sharp enough to cut doubt. He laughed at something Lord Pemberton said, his hand resting on the old man's shoulder, playing the part of the benevolent ruler. But Evelyn saw the distraction in his eyes, the way they kept drifting toward the southern entrance. He was waiting for her. Celine Voss arrived fashionably late, which meant she arrived exactly when she intended every eye in the room to turn. And they did. All of them. She wore crimson, a gown that clung to her body like a second skin, cut low enough to make the dowagers gasp and high enough on the thigh to make their husbands forget their own names. Her hair fell in perfect black waves over pale shoulders, and when she smiled, it was the kind of smile that made men feel like they'd won something just by being in the same room. Evelyn felt the shift in the air before she saw Adrian move. It was subtle, the way predators sense prey. He excused himself from Lord Pemberton and crossed the hall with purpose, his stride eating up marble in seconds. When he reached Celine, he took her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, holding the contact just long enough that whispers started spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Lady Marguerite, the queen's oldest attendant, appeared at Evelyn's elbow. She was 70 if she was a day, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, and she'd served the crown since before Evelyn was born. "Your Majesty," Marguerite said quietly, her voice barely above a murmur, "perhaps we should retire for the evening." "No," Evelyn's voice was steady. "We stay. The king is making a spectacle." "Then let him." Across the hall, Adrian was leading Celine onto the dance floor. The orchestra swelled into a waltz, and they moved together like they'd been doing it for years instead of months. His hand pressed against the small of her back. Her fingers traced the line of his shoulder. They didn't look at anyone else. The whispers grew louder. Evelyn stood perfectly still, her face a mask of composed neutrality, but inside her chest something ancient and cold began to wake. Not jealousy. That was too simple, too raw. This was calculation, assessment. The quiet recognition that the game she'd been playing for 12 years had just changed its rules. "Who is she?" Evelyn asked. Marguerite hesitated. "Lady Celine Voss, minor nobility from the southern provinces. Her father was Baron Voss, died 8 years ago under questionable circumstances. She's been living in the capital for 6 months. Why haven't I met her? She doesn't attend court functions, moves in different circles, younger crowds, artists and merchants, people with ambition but no titles." Marguerite paused. "Until now." Evelyn watched the way Adrian's hand tightened on Celine's waist, the way he leaned in to whisper something that made her throw her head back and laugh. It was a practice sound, musical and inviting, designed to draw attention. "She's been here 6 months," Evelyn said slowly, "and my husband just happened to notice her tonight?" "The rumors started 3 weeks ago, Your Majesty. Private dinners, late-night visits to his study. Some say she's been advising him on trade negotiations with the Eastern Territories." Advising him? Evelyn's voice was flat. A woman with no diplomatic training or political experience is advising the king on trade policy. "Yes, Your Majesty." The music swelled, and Adrian spun Celine across the floor, her crimson dress flaring like blood in water. Every eye in the room tracked their movement. The nobles weren't even pretending to look away anymore. This wasn't subtle. This was a declaration. Evelyn turned from the balcony and walked deeper into the hall, her movements measured and deliberate. She stopped near a cluster of ministers, Lord Chancellor Hayes and Master of Coin Thornwick, both old guard who'd served Adrian's father before him. Hayes saw her first. He was a thin man with wire-frame glasses and the perpetually worried expression of someone who'd spent 40 years watching kingdoms rise and fall over bad decisions. "Your Majesty," he bowed stiffly. "A lovely evening." "Is it?" Evelyn kept her voice light, conversational. "I was just admiring the king's dancing." Thornwick coughed into his fist. He was broader than Hayes, red-faced and balding, with the blunt manner of a man who'd made his fortune counting other people's gold. "The king has always been sociable." "Sociable?" Evelyn smiled, and it didn't reach her eyes. "Is that what we're calling it?" Hayes shot Thornwick a warning glance, but the Master of Coin was already committed. "Your Majesty, if I may speak plainly." "Please do." "There are concerns. Among the council. The king has been distracted. Meetings postponed. Decisions delayed. Last week's session on the northern border dispute was cancelled entirely because His Majesty claimed illness, yet he was seen that same afternoon riding through the forest with Lady Voss." Evelyn absorbed this information like a blade between the ribs, her expression never changing. "I see. We mean no disrespect," Hayes added quickly, "but the kingdom requires leadership, steady leadership, and right now my husband is dancing." Evelyn's voice was soft but carried the weight of absolute authority. "As kings do at state functions. I'm certain any momentary distractions will resolve themselves. Don't you agree?" It wasn't a question. Both men recognized the dismissal and bowed their way out of the conversation, leaving Evelyn alone near a pillar while the music played on and the king continued his very public display of infatuation. She caught glimpses of Celine throughout the night, always at Adrian's side, always touching him, a hand on his arm, fingers brushing his shoulder, leaning in close to whisper things that made him smile in ways Evelyn hadn't seen in years. The woman moved through the court like she'd already claimed it, her confidence absolute, her beauty weaponized. Near midnight, Evelyn finally retreated to her chambers, not because she was defeated, but because watching required energy and she needed to conserve her strength. Marguerite followed her through the winding corridors of the palace, past guards who bowed and servants who averted their eyes. The queen's apartments were in the eastern wing, a suite of rooms decorated in deep blues and silvers, elegant but not ostentatious. Evelyn dismissed her attendants and stood alone in front of the tall windows overlooking the capital below. Thousands of lights flickered in the darkness, homes and shops and taverns where ordinary people lived ordinary lives, unaware that their king was currently unraveling the foundations of everything they depended on. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat at her writing desk and began making lists. Names, allies, people who owed her favors, generals who'd served under her father before he died, ministers who remembered what loyalty meant, merchants who'd benefited from her quiet interventions when the king's attention wandered. She wrote until dawn, her handwriting small and precise, building an inventory of resources she might need. Because Evelyn Carter hadn't survived 12 years as queen by being naive, she'd survived by being prepared. The affair became impossible to ignore within a week. Adrian no longer bothered with discretion. He moved Celine into rooms in the western wing, a suite that had previously belonged to visiting dignitaries. Now it belonged to the king's mistress, and everyone knew it. Servants gossiped in the kitchens. Guards exchanged knowing looks. The nobles who'd once bent over backward to curry favor with the queen suddenly found reasons to visit the Western Wing, carrying gifts and flattery for the woman who'd captured the king's attention. Celine held court like she'd been born to it. She received visitors in her chambers, dispensed advice on matters she had no business discussing, and wore jewels that appeared on her neck and wrists like magic. Gifts from the king, rubies and diamonds and emeralds that could have fed a province for a year. Evelyn watched it all from a distance, her face neutral, her movements careful. She continued attending council meetings, even though Adrian rarely showed up anymore. She reviewed trade agreements and signed documents that needed the royal seal. She met with ambassadors and smoothed over tensions when the king's absence became too obvious to excuse. But at night, alone in her chambers, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what was happening. Not grief. Grief was too soft. This was rage, cold and controlled, the kind of anger that didn't burn hot but instead calcified into something harder, more useful. 3 weeks after the Harvest Gala, Adrian finally came to see her. It was late afternoon, and Evelyn was in her study reviewing grain reports from the eastern provinces when the door opened without warning. No knock, no announcement, just Adrian walking in like he still had the right to her space, her time, her attention. She looked up from the papers spread across her desk. He looked tired, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 6 months ago. His shirt was half untucked and his hair was disheveled in a way that suggested he had just rolled out of someone else's bed. Evelyn. His voice was rough. We need to talk. She set down her pen with deliberate care. Do we? Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I'm not making anything hard, Adrian. I'm reviewing grain reports. You're the one who walked into my study without an invitation. He flinched at the formality in her voice. Once upon a time, she'd called him by pet names, whispered things in the dark that made him feel like more than a crown with legs. Now she spoke to him like she spoke to the master of coin, polite, distant, correct. I know you're angry, he said. Am I? Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. What makes you think that? Evelyn, Your Majesty. Her voice was soft. When we're alone, you call me by my name, but in formal settings, or when discussing matters of state, you use my title. This feels like a matter of state, don't you think? Adrian's jaw tightened. Fine, Your Majesty. I didn't come here to fight. Then why did you come? Because I owe you honesty. Evelyn almost laughed. Almost. Honesty, how refreshing. Please go ahead. He moved to the window, putting distance between them, and stared out at the gardens below. I met someone. I noticed. She's different. She understands me in ways... He stopped, catching himself. I'm not trying to hurt you. Then what are you trying to do? I don't know. He turned to face her, and for the first time she saw genuine confusion in his eyes. I don't know what this is or where it's going, but I can't stop thinking about her. When I'm with her, I feel like myself again, like I'm not just the crown. I'm a man. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. Evelyn's voice was clinical. You're having a midlife crisis, and you've decided to work through it by humiliating your wife in front of the entire kingdom. Very understandable. That's not fair. Fair? Now she did laugh, a short, sharp sound. You want to talk about fair? You've been king for 12 years, Adrian. I've stood beside you through wars and famines and assassination attempts. I've negotiated treaties while you were out hunting. I've held this kingdom together when your father's death almost tore it apart. And now you walk into my study and tell me you've met someone who makes you feel like a man again, as if I've spent the last decade turning you into something less. I didn't mean it like that. How did you mean it? He had no answer, just stood there looking lost and frustrated and entirely too comfortable with his own selfishness. Evelyn felt something shift inside her, a final thread snapping, and she realized with absolute clarity that this marriage was already over, had been over for months. She'd just been too busy holding the kingdom together to notice. Get out, she said quietly. Evelyn, Your Majesty. She picked up her pen again, returning her attention to the grain reports. And next time you want to confess your feelings, make an appointment. I'm very busy these days. He left without another word. Back. Celine Voss understood power the way some people understood music. It was instinct, a gift. She'd been born with nothing, a minor baron's daughter in a forgotten province, and she'd spent her entire life learning how to take what she wanted from people who had more. Men were easy. They always had been. Flash some skin, laugh at their jokes, make them feel like the most important person in the room, and they'd hand over kingdoms if you asked nicely enough. Women were harder. Women saw through the performance, recognized the manipulation, and either became allies or enemies. There was no middle ground. Queen Evelyn Carter was definitely an enemy. Celine knew this the moment she'd seen the Queen at the Harvest Gala, standing on that balcony with her spine straight and her face composed while her husband danced with another woman. Most wives would have made a scene, tears, accusations, public humiliation. But not Evelyn. She'd just watched, assessed, filed the information away like she was building a case. Dangerous, but also vulnerable, because no matter how composed she looked, no matter how regal, she was still just a woman watching her husband fall in love with someone else, and that meant she could be broken. Celine stood in her chambers, examining herself in the full-length mirror. The dress she'd chosen for tonight was gold, almost scandalous in its construction, designed to make every man in the room forget his own name and every woman question her worth. She turned sideways, checking the drape of fabric across her hips, and smiled at her reflection. Perfect. There was a knock at the door. She called permission and one of Adrian's personal guards entered, a young man named Marcus who'd proven very useful these past few weeks. Handsome in that brutish way common soldiers often were, and desperately eager to please. Lady Voss, he bowed. His Majesty requests your presence in the Rose Garden. Does he? Celine kept her voice playful. And what if I'm busy? Marcus's eyes traveled down her body before snapping back to her face, his cheeks coloring. He said it was urgent, my lady. Everything is urgent with kings. She moved past him, letting her fingers trail across his chest as she passed, feeling him tense under her touch. But I suppose I shouldn't keep him waiting. The Rose Garden was in the southern corner of the palace grounds, a sprawling maze of hedges and flower beds where the royal family had been hosting private gatherings for generations. Adrian was waiting near the central fountain, dressed in hunting clothes, his expression lighting up when he saw her approach. There you are. He reached for her hands, pulling her close. I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me. Forgotten? Celine pressed herself against him, feeling the immediate response in his body. How could I forget the most powerful man in the kingdom? He kissed her then, deep and hungry, his hands roaming across her back and down to her hips. She let him, even encouraged it, making small sounds of pleasure that she'd practiced until they sounded completely genuine. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she traced her fingers along his jaw and let her expression turn serious. We need to talk. About what? About your wife. Adrian's face tightened. What about her? She's turning the council against you. Celine kept her voice gentle, concerned, like she was worried about his well-being rather than her own position. Lord Hayes and Master Thornwick have been meeting with her privately. They're questioning your decisions, your leadership. That's their job. No. She turned away from him, moving toward the fountain, letting him follow. Their job is to advise you, not undermine you. But that's exactly what they're doing, and Evelyn is encouraging it. Evelyn wouldn't what? Celine spun back to face him. Wouldn't try to maintain control while you're distracted? Adrian, she's been queen for 12 years. Do you really think she's just going to step aside while you rebuild your life? While you choose happiness? He looked uncertain, caught between loyalty to the past and desire for the future. Celine pressed her advantage. I'm not trying to cause problems, she said softly, but you need to know what's happening in your own court. The nobles are whispering. The servants are gossiping, and your wife is positioning herself as the stable one while painting you as reckless and irresponsible. She hasn't said anything to me. Of course not. She's too smart for that. But actions speak louder than words, don't they? Celine moved closer again, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper. She's attending meetings you skip, signing documents you haven't reviewed, meeting with generals and ministers behind closed doors. She's not just being a good queen, she's building her own power base. Adrian's jaw worked as he processed this. Celine could see the doubt taking root, the paranoia that comes naturally to people with crowns on their heads. She'd planted the seed. Now she just needed to water it. What should I do? He asked finally. Protect yourself. She took his hands again, squeezing gently. Protect us. You're the king, Adrian. Start acting like it. Make decisions, assert your authority, and maybe— She paused as if the thought had just occurred to her. Maybe it's time to formalize our relationship. Formalize? Give me a title, a position at court, something that makes it clear I'm not just a passing fancy, that I'm important to you, to the kingdom's future. His eyes widened slightly. Evelyn would never accept that. Evelyn doesn't get a choice. Celine's voice hardened just enough to show steel beneath the silk. She's your wife, not your master, and if she's truly as loyal as everyone claims, she'll accept what makes you happy. She could see him turning it over in his mind, weighing the political ramifications against his desire, and she knew which side would win. It always did. I'll think about it, he said finally. Celine smiled and kissed him again, slower this time, sealing the promise. The formal announcement came 2 weeks later during a full council session. Evelyn sat in her usual place at the long table, surrounded by ministers and advisors who'd served the crown for decades. Adrian was at the head of the table, looking more alert than he had in months, his posture straight and his voice clear. "Gentlemen," he said, "and your Majesty, I have an announcement regarding the structure of the court." Evelyn felt every muscle in her body tense. She kept her face neutral, but her hands gripped the armrests of her chair hard enough that her knuckles went white. Adrian continued, "Effective immediately, Lady Celine Voss will be granted the title of Duchess of Thornwick and appointed as special advisor to the Crown on matters of trade and diplomatic relations." The room erupted. Lord Hayes stood so quickly his chair scraped backward. "Your Majesty, this is highly irregular. The lady has no experience in—" "She has my confidence," Adrian cut him off, "and that should be sufficient." "But the position doesn't exist," Thornwick sputtered, his face going even redder than usual. "Special advisor? We already have ministers for trade and diplomacy. What exactly would her role be?" "Whatever I decide it should be." Adrian's voice carried an edge now, a warning. "I'm the king. I don't require the council's approval to appoint advisors." "You require our advice before making decisions that affect the stability of the crown," Hayes shot back. "And this decision is reckless. The lady is untested, unproven, and her sudden elevation will be seen as favoritism at best and corruption at worst." "Are you questioning my judgment?" "I'm questioning your wisdom." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Everyone turned to look at Evelyn, waiting for her response, waiting to see if the queen would defend her husband or let him hang himself with his own rope. She stood slowly, drawing every eye. When she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, absolutely controlled. "The king has made his decision," she said, "as he is entitled to do. If His Majesty believes Lady Voss can serve the kingdom, then we should support that belief until proven otherwise." Adrian looked surprised, relieved, like he'd expected a fight, and instead received surrender. But Hayes wasn't finished. "Your Majesty," he addressed Evelyn directly, "with respect, this sets a dangerous precedent. If we allow personal relationships to dictate political appointments, then we would be no different than any other kingdom in history," Evelyn interrupted smoothly. "Kings have always appointed advisors based on trust and personal connection. My husband is no exception. However," she turned to Adrian, "I assume Lady Voss will be subject to the same oversight and accountability as every other member of this council?" "Of course," Adrian said quickly. "And her decisions will be reviewed and approved through proper channels before implementation?" "Yes." "Then I see no issue." Evelyn gathered her papers. "If there's nothing else, I have appointments to keep." She walked out of the council chamber before anyone could respond, her spine straight, her steps measured, giving no indication of the fury burning beneath her skin. Marguerite was waiting in the corridor outside. The old woman fell into step beside her as Evelyn moved through the palace with purpose. "Your Majesty, you can't seriously be—" "Not here." Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper. "My chambers. Now." They made it to the Queen's apartments without encountering anyone. Evelyn dismissed the guards, closed the doors, and finally allowed her composure to crack. Not collapse, just crack, enough to let some of the pressure out before it exploded. "He appointed his mistress to the council," Marguerite said flatly, "in front of everyone. gave her a duchy and a made-up position, and dared anyone to challenge him. I know. The nobles will see this as weakness. The people will see it as corruption. I know. Then why didn't you stop him? Evelyn moved to the window, looking out at the capital below. Because stopping him would have made me the villain, the jealous wife, the bitter queen clinging to power. This way, I look reasonable, supportive, above the pettiness, while he destroys everything you've built. No, Evelyn turned back to face her oldest friend. While he gives me exactly what I need. Marguerite frowned. I don't understand. Celine Voss is now a public figure. She has a title, a position, which means her actions are subject to scrutiny, her decisions can be questioned, her mistakes will be documented. Evelyn's smile was cold and sharp. Adrian just gave his mistress enough rope to hang herself. We just have to wait for her to tie the knot. And if she doesn't make mistakes? Everyone makes mistakes. Evelyn returned to her desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. We just need to make sure hers are impossible to ignore. She began writing, her hand steady, her mind clear. Lists of people to contact, questions to ask, records to review. If Celine Voss was going to be special advisor to the crown, then Evelyn would make absolutely certain she earned that title. Every decision would be examined, every recommendation questioned, every mistake documented and filed away for future use. Because Queen Evelyn Carter hadn't survived 12 years by making scenes or throwing tantrums or begging for love that was already gone. She'd survived by being smarter than everyone else in the room, by playing the long game while everyone else scrambled for short-term victories. And right now, watching her husband destroy himself for a woman who saw him as nothing more than a stepping stone, Evelyn was playing the longest game of her life. Patag. 3 months after Celine's appointment, the kingdom began to show cracks. It started small. Delayed responses to trade inquiries from neighboring kingdoms, confused orders sent to military outposts along the northern border, a shipment of grain mysteriously redirected to warehouses controlled by nobles friendly to Celine rather than distributed to provinces facing shortages. Nothing catastrophic, just inefficient, sloppy. The kind of mistakes that happen when someone with no experience is given authority they haven't earned. Evelyn documented everything. She spent her days attending meetings Celine skipped, reviewing decisions Celine made without consulting the proper ministers, and quietly correcting course whenever the ship started listing too far to one side. She never complained, never criticized, just worked, steady and relentless, keeping the kingdom functional while the king's attention wandered and his new advisor played at politics like it was a game. But she also started building, carefully, quietly, networks of loyalty that had nothing to do with her husband and everything to do with the survival of the crown itself. General Marcus Trent was her first recruit. He commanded the Eastern Legions, 50,000 soldiers loyal to the crown and suspicious of anyone who tried to meddle with military funding. Evelyn invited him to a private dinner under the pretense of discussing supply chains, and by the end of the meal she'd secured his absolute loyalty. The king is distracted, Trent said bluntly. He was a scarred, weathered man in his 50s who'd spent 30 years fighting border wars and had no patience for courtly bullshit. That woman has him by the balls and she's squeezing. Crude, Evelyn said mildly, but accurate. What do you need from me? Nothing yet, but if things get worse, I need to know the army will remember who kept them fed and equipped while the king was otherwise occupied. Trent's eyes narrowed. You planning a coup, Your Majesty? I'm planning to save the kingdom from itself. There's a difference. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. You have my loyalty, and my swords, if it comes to that. Let's hope it doesn't. But Evelyn was preparing for the possibility. Over the next few weeks, she met with Chancellor Hayes and Master Thornwick, securing their support with careful reminders of every time she'd protected their positions from the king's impulsive decisions. She cultivated relationships with influential merchants who controlled the flow of goods through the capital. She even reached out to the common folk, walking through markets and neighborhoods the queen wasn't supposed to visit, listening to complaints about rising taxes and food shortages while soldiers went unpaid. The people loved her for it, started calling her the People's Queen, a title that made Adrian furious when he heard about it. You're undermining me, he accused one night, cornering her in the corridor outside her chambers. Evelyn stopped walking and turned to face him. I'm doing my job. Your job is to support the king. My job is to support the kingdom. If those two things happen to align, wonderful. If not, she shrugged. I make choices. You're turning the court against me. No, Adrian, you did that yourself when you appointed a mistress with no qualifications to a position she's completely unequipped to handle. I'm just cleaning up the mess. His face flushed with anger. She's trying. You just refuse to see it because you're jealous. Jealous? Evelyn laughed, genuinely amused. Of what? Her ability to manipulate you? Her complete lack of shame? Please, if I wanted to destroy you, I could do it with one speech in front of the council. But I won't. Because despite everything, I still care about this kingdom more than I hate what you've become. She walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing alone in the corridor, and it occurred to her that this was the moment, the point of no return. They'd crossed some invisible line, and there was no going back to whatever they'd been before. Good. She was tired of pretending. Selena Voss stood in her chambers, surrounded by documents she didn't understand and advisors who barely hid their contempt. Being special advisor to the crown was supposed to feel like power. Instead, it felt like drowning in bureaucracy. The eastern provinces are requesting additional grain shipments, one of the ministers was saying. His name was something boring. Thomas? Theodore? She couldn't remember and didn't care. But our current stores are allocated for... Redirect them, Celine interrupted. Problem solved. My lady, if we redirect grain from the northern warehouses, those supplies were intended for the military. The military has enough. Send the grain east. The minister exchanged a glance with his colleague, another forgettable man in brown robes. With respect, Lady Voss, the military has been requesting additional supplies for months. General Trent specifically. I don't care what General Trent requested. I'm making the decision. Celine's voice hardened. Unless you're questioning my authority. No, my lady. But his tone said otherwise. After they left, Celine poured herself wine and stared at the maps spread across her desk. Trade routes and border disputes and endless numbers that blurred together into meaningless noise. This wasn't what she'd signed up for. She'd wanted the title, the position, the respect. The actual work was supposed to be handled by underlings. There was a knock at the door. Marcus, the guard, entered without waiting for permission. Lady Voss? He closed the door behind him. We need to talk. She turned to face him, annoyed. About what? About the fact that you're making decisions that contradict standing orders from the Queen and the Council, and people are starting to notice. Let them notice. I have the King's support. The King's support won't mean much if the military decides to stop following orders. Marcus moved closer, his voice dropping. You're playing a dangerous game. Queen Evelyn has been building alliances for months. Generals, ministers, common folk. If this comes to a confrontation, it won't. How can you be sure? Because I'm going to eliminate the threat, Celine thought. But she didn't say that out loud. Instead, she smiled and moved toward Marcus, letting her body language shift into something softer, more inviting. Because I have you, she murmured. Don't I? He tensed as she traced her fingers up his chest. My lady, you've been so helpful these past few months, so loyal. I appreciate that. She leaned in close, her breath warm against his ear. And loyalty should be rewarded. She felt him waver, caught between duty and desire, and pressed her advantage. Her hands roamed lower, her lips found his neck. And just like that, another piece fell into place on her board. Men were so easy. The breaking point came during the winter assembly. It was tradition, a gathering of every major noble family in the kingdom to discuss the state of the realm before the harsh months set in. The grand hall was packed with lords and ladies dressed in their finest, all watching the throne with hungry eyes, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. King Adrian sat on his throne with Celine standing beside him, a position that should have belonged to the queen. Evelyn was relegated to a seat among the council, her face composed but her eyes tracking every movement like a hawk. Lord Pemberton, the oldest and most respected noble in attendance, stood to address the crown. Your Majesty, the northern provinces are facing severe food shortages. The harvest was poor and winter is coming early. We request emergency supplies from the royal reserves. Adrian glanced at Celine. When? She leaned in and whispered something in his ear. The request is denied, Adrian announced. Our reserves are allocated for other purposes. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Pemberton's face darkened. Your Majesty, people will starve. Then they should have planned better. This time it was Celine who spoke, her voice carrying across the hall. The Crown cannot be expected to bail out every province that fails to manage its own resources. The murmur turned into outrage. Evelyn stood slowly, drawing every eye. If I may, Your Majesty? Adrian looked uncertain. Celine looked furious, but protocol demanded he allow the Queen to speak. The northern provinces have been loyal to this crown for generations, Evelyn said, her voice clear and steady. They've sent soldiers to our wars, paid their taxes without complaint, and now they're asking for help during a crisis. Denying that request isn't fiscal responsibility, it's cruelty. The Queen is being emotional, Celine cut in. This is a matter of policy, not sentiment. Then let's discuss policy. Evelyn's smile was sharp. Lady Voss, perhaps you could explain to the Assembly why the grain that was meant for the northern provinces was instead redirected to warehouses controlled by nobles who just happened to support your position at court? The hall went silent. Celine's face paled. That's a baseless accusation. Is it? Evelyn pulled a document from her sleeve and held it up. This is the order you signed 3 weeks ago. Your signature, your seal. Redirecting 12,000 bushels of grain from public warehouses to private holdings. Would you like me to read the names of the nobles who benefited? Adrian stood from his throne. Evelyn, what are you doing? I'm doing what someone should have done months ago, holding your special advisor accountable for her decisions. Evelyn's voice was cold. Because while you've been distracted, she's been looting the kingdom. The crowd erupted. Nobles shouted accusations. Ministers demanded answers. And in the chaos, Evelyn calmly approached the throne, holding out the document for all to see. Celine tried to recover. Your Majesty, this is clearly a misunderstanding. The Queen is twisting facts to make me look. The facts speak for themselves, Evelyn interrupted. Shall I continue? Because I have 12 more documents just like this one. Trade agreements that favor specific merchants. Military orders that left the northern border undermanned. Financial allocations that make no strategic sense unless you understand who profits from them. She spread the documents across the floor of the hall like cards from a deck, each one damning, each one signed by Celine's hand. Adrian stared at the papers, then at Celine, then at Evelyn. For the first time in months, the fog cleared from his eyes, and he saw exactly what had been happening while he was busy falling in love. This can't be right, he said quietly. It's all right there. Evelyn's voice was steady. Your advisor has been using her position to enrich herself and her allies while the kingdom suffers. You gave her power, Adrian. This is what she did with it. Celine's mask finally cracked. You smug bitch. You think you're so clever, but you're just a dried-up old woman clinging to a man who doesn't want you anymore. I gave him something you never could. I made him feel alive. You made him feel useful, Evelyn corrected. There's a difference. And now everyone in this hall can see exactly what you are. Not a partner, not an advisor, just an opportunist who saw a weakness and exploited it. The crowd turned on Celine like wolves. Accusations flew. Nobles who'd courted her favor now distanced themselves. And through it all, Adrian just stood there, watching the woman he'd sacrificed everything for disintegrate under the weight of her own greed and ambition. Evelyn turned to leave, her work done, but paused at the edge of the hall. Your Majesty, she said, addressing Adrian formally, I suggest you review every decision Lady Voss has made since taking her position. I suspect you'll find more problems than just grain shipments, but that's your responsibility. I've done my part. She walked out of the hall, leaving the king to face the catastrophe he'd created. And for the first time in months, Queen Evelyn Carter allowed herself to smile. Because this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of the reckoning. The guards found Celine in her chambers 3 hours after the assembly dissolved into chaos. She was packing. Not carefully, not strategically, just throwing jewels and dresses into leather cases like a thief fleeing before dawn. Her hands shook as she worked, her perfect composure finally shattered into something raw and animal. Marcus stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. The young guard, who'd been so eager to please, so easy to manipulate, now looked at her like she was already a ghost. What are you doing? He asked quietly. What does it look like? Her voice was sharp, defensive. I'm leaving before that bitch gets me arrested. The king wants to see you. I bet he does. Celine laughed, high and brittle. So he can throw me to the wolves in front of everyone? Make a public show of rejecting the woman he claimed to love? No thank you. Running will only make it worse. Worse than what? She spun to face him, her eyes wild. Worse than standing trial for crimes I didn't commit? Those documents were forged. Evelyn set me up. Were they forged? It wasn't really a question. Marcus had been watching for months, seeing things he'd tried to ignore because she was beautiful and he was weak, and wanting was easier than thinking. But now, with the illusion stripped away, he saw her clearly for the first time. Not a victim, not even a villain, just someone who'd gambled everything and lost. Get out! Celine hissed. He left without another word. Alone, she returned to her packing with renewed urgency. The plan had been so simple: seduce the king, gain influence, use that influence to build wealth and power until she was untouchable. Queens died all the time. Accidents happened. And when Evelyn was gone, there would be nothing between Celine and the crown except a grieving king who needed comfort. But she'd underestimated the woman, assumed silence meant weakness, mistook patience for defeat, and now Evelyn had turned the entire court against her with a handful of documents and one devastating speech. The worst part was knowing the documents weren't forged. Every signature was real, every decision documented. Celine had been so confident in Adrian's protection, so certain she was untouchable, that she'd gotten sloppy, left trails, made mistakes that a smarter woman would have buried. She was still packing when Adrian finally came. He didn't knock, just walked in like he owned the place, which technically he did, and stood there staring at her with an expression somewhere between fury and heartbreak. You lied to me, he said. Celine's survival instinct kicked in. She dropped the dress she was holding and moved toward him, reaching for his hands, letting tears well in her eyes. Adrian, please, you have to understand. Evelyn twisted everything. Those documents are real. His voice was flat. I had the Master of Coin verify them. Every signature, every seal, every single decision you made that benefited corrupt nobles while the kingdom suffered. I was trying to help. You were helping yourself. He pulled his hands away from her grasp. Do you have any idea what you've done? The northern provinces are on the brink of starvation. The military is undermanned because you redirected supply funds. And the nobles you enriched? Half of them are under investigation for embezzlement. That's not my fault. You signed the orders! Adrian's voice rose, echoing off the stone walls. You stood beside me at the assembly and called Evelyn cruel for wanting to help starving people while you were looting the treasury. How stupid do you think I am? Celine's tears dried instantly, replaced by cold calculation. She could see it now, the way his body language had shifted, the way he looked at her like she was a stranger. The love was gone, burned away by embarrassment and rage, which meant charm wouldn't work anymore. She needed a different weapon. Fine. Her voice hardened. You want the truth? I did what I had to do to survive in this cesspool you call a court. You gave me a made-up title and no real power and expected me to magically know how to navigate politics I'd never been taught. Those nobles approached me with opportunities. I took them. That's not corruption. That's survival. That's theft. No, theft is what your wife has been doing for 12 years. She stole your attention, your respect, your confidence. She made you feel small so she could feel big. And when you finally found someone who made you feel like a king again, she destroyed it because she couldn't stand losing. Adrian stared at her for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was tired. I loved you. I actually loved you. And you were just using me the entire time. Of course I was using you. Celine's laugh was bitter. What else was I supposed to do? I was born with nothing. No title, no inheritance, no power. Just a face and a body and the intelligence to know how to use them. You think Evelyn got where she is through virtue? She married into power. At least I earned mine. By stealing from the kingdom. By taking what the kingdom owed me. Her eyes flashed. I gave you passion, purpose. I made you feel things your cold bitch of a wife hasn't made you feel in years. That has value. And if I profited from it, so what? You profited too. How? You got to feel alive again. You got to remember you're a man, not just a crown. Celine moved closer. One last attempt at connection. We could have had everything, Adrian. We could have ruled together. But Evelyn couldn't stand that, so she manufactured a crisis to turn you against me. She didn't manufacture anything. Adrian's voice was quiet now, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. She just held up a mirror so I could see what I'd become. A fool. A bad king. A worse husband. And it's not her fault. It's mine. So what now? Celine's voice was sharp. You throw me out? Imprison me? Execute me for loving you? You'll be stripped of your title and exiled to the southern provinces. Adrian wouldn't meet her eyes. You'll be given a small estate and enough income to live modestly, but you're never to return to the capital. If you do, you'll be arrested. That's it? After everything? After everything, you're lucky I don't have you tried for treason. Adrian finally looked at her, and his expression was carved from stone. The only reason you're getting mercy is because killing you would make you a martyr. This way you just disappear. Forgotten. He left without waiting for a response. Celine stood alone in her chambers, surrounded by half-packed cases and the ruins of her ambition, and for the first time in her life felt the cold certainty of absolute defeat. Not the temporary setbacks she'd experienced before, the ones you could charm or manipulate your way out of. This was permanent, final, the kind of ending that left no room for comebacks. She'd gambled everything on a weak king and lost to a patient queen. The guards came at dawn to escort her out of the palace. She left through the servants' entrance, her face covered, her cases carried by men who wouldn't meet her eyes. No ceremony, no farewell, just a quiet exit from a kingdom she'd tried to steal. From her window in the eastern wing, Queen Evelyn watched the carriage disappear down the road toward the southern provinces. She felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just the grim recognition that she'd done what needed doing and the cost had been high for everyone involved. Marguerite appeared at her elbow. It's done then. It's done. The kingdom will recover, eventually. Evelyn turned from the window. We'll release grain to the northern provinces today, restore the military funding, undo as much damage as possible. It'll take time, but we'll survive. And the king? Evelyn's expression didn't change. The king will learn to live with his choices, as will I. What she didn't say was that the marriage was over in every way that mattered. They'd continue playing their roles in public, maintaining the appearance of unity for the sake of the crown. But privately, the distance between them had become a chasm too wide to cross. Adrian had broken something fundamental when he chose Celine, and Evelyn had broken something in herself when she'd spent months methodically destroying the woman he loved. They were both casualties of this war. The only question now was whether they could rebuild enough trust to keep the kingdom stable. The council meeting that afternoon was tense. Every minister and advisor who'd witnessed yesterday's spectacle now sat around the table trying to figure out how to proceed. Adrian was at the head, looking 10 years older than he had a week ago. Evelyn sat in her usual place, composed and professional. Lord Hayes cleared his throat. Your Majesty, the assembly yesterday raised serious concerns about the stability of the crown. There are questions about leadership, about judgment, about whether the king can be trusted to rule without being manipulated by the next beautiful woman who walks through the door. Adrian's voice was harsh. You can say it plainly, Hayes. I've earned the criticism. The room shifted uncomfortably. Kings didn't admit weakness. It violated something fundamental in the power structure they all depended on. The issue isn't trust, Evelyn said smoothly. It's process. Moving forward, all appointments to positions of authority will require council approval. All major policy decisions will be reviewed by relevant ministers before implementation, and all financial allocations above a certain threshold will be subject to oversight. You want to limit the king's power? Thornwick said slowly. I want to protect the kingdom from future mistakes. Evelyn met Adrian's eyes across the table. By anyone, including myself. Adrian could have fought it, could have reasserted his absolute authority and forced the council to back down. Instead, he nodded once, accepting the constraints, recognizing that his authority had been damaged by his own actions and needed time to rebuild. Agreed, he said quietly. Draft the new protocols and I'll sign them. Hayes looked like he might faint from shock. The other ministers exchanged glances. This was unprecedented, a king voluntarily reducing his own power. But it was also practical, necessary, the only way forward that didn't involve civil war or forced abdication. There's one more matter, General Trent said from the far end of the table. The northern border situation has deteriorated. Without proper funding and supplies for the last 3 months, our positions are weak. The Eastern kingdoms are taking notice. How weak? Adrian asked. Weak enough that an organized assault could break through in less than a week. Trent's voice was grim. We need immediate reinforcement. Troops, supplies, and a clear command structure that won't change every time His Majesty gets distracted. The barb landed. Adrian's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Just turned to Evelyn. What do you suggest? Send General Trent north with full authority to fortify the border, release all requested funds, and make it clear to our neighbors that any territorial aggression will be met with overwhelming force. Evelyn's voice was steady. We're vulnerable right now. We can't afford to look weak. Agreed. Adrian looked at Trent. You have whatever you need. Leave within the week. The meeting continued for another hour, working through logistics and damage control, and through it all, Evelyn maintained her careful composure. Professional, competent, exactly the kind of leader the kingdom needed while its king was busy hating himself. When they finally adjourned, Adrian approached her before she could leave. We need to talk. We just did. Privately. She wanted to refuse, wanted to walk away and let him sit with the consequences of his choices. But they were still bound by duty and crown and 12 years of history that couldn't be erased by one catastrophic affair. So she followed him to his private study, a wood-paneled room filled with maps and books and the smell of old leather. He closed the door and leaned against his desk, suddenly looking exhausted. I'm sorry. For what specifically? Her voice was cold. Falling in love with another woman? Humiliating me in front of the court? Nearly destroying the kingdom? You'll need to be more precise. All of it. He ran his hands through his hair. I was an idiot, a selfish, arrogant idiot who thought he could have everything without consequences. Yes, you were. I know you won't forgive me. Adrian met her eyes. I'm not asking you to, but I need you to know that I see it now. What I did, what I became. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to fix it. Evelyn studied him, looking for manipulation or self-pity, but found only genuine remorse. It didn't change anything, didn't heal the wounds or restore what they'd lost. But it was something. You can start by being the king this kingdom needs, she said quietly. Not the man you want to be, the leader we require. No more distractions, no more impulses, just steady, competent governance. And us? There is no us. Not anymore. Evelyn's voice was matter-of-fact. There's a king and a queen who share a duty to protect their people. That's all. So we just pretend? Play our roles in public and live as strangers privately? Yes. For how long? Forever, if necessary. She moved toward the door. I've already made peace with it, Adrian. You should do the same. She left him alone in his study, surrounded by the weight of his choices, and felt nothing. Not anger, not grief, just the cold certainty that she'd survived something that should have destroyed her and come out stronger on the other side. The weeks that followed were a blur of reconstruction. Evelyn threw herself into the work of stabilizing the kingdom with the same focused intensity she'd used to destroy Selene. Grain shipments were restored to the northern provinces. Military funding was released, and General Trent began fortifying the border. The corrupt nobles who'd profited from Selene's schemes were quietly removed from their positions and replaced with officials who understood that loyalty meant serving the crown, not looting it. The people noticed, started calling her the Savior Queen, a title that made the remaining nobles nervous because it suggested power that existed independent of her husband. But Evelyn didn't discourage it. She needed that power, needed the people's support as insurance against future instability. Because she'd learned something crucial during the months of Adrian's affair. A queen's authority wasn't derived from her husband. It was earned through competence, loyalty, and the willingness to do what needed doing even when it cost everything. Adrian had been a weak king, but Evelyn was becoming something more dangerous, a strong queen who no longer needed him. The realization terrified the court. Lord Pemberton approached her one evening after a council session, his weathered face troubled. Your Majesty, a word? Of course. He waited until they were alone in the corridor before speaking. The nobles are worried about the balance of power. Elaborate. You've accumulated significant influence. The military respects you. The people love you, and the ministers defer to your judgment more than the king's. Pemberton's voice was careful. Some are beginning to question who truly rules Valadorn. The king rules. Evelyn's voice was smooth. I simply assist. That's the problem. It doesn't look like assistance anymore. It looks like control. Would you prefer the alternative? A distracted king making impulsive decisions that nearly triggered a civil war? No, of course not. But there are concerns about precedent. If a queen can override the king, what does that mean for the stability of succession? What happens when Adrian dies and the crown passes to his heir? Then the heir will rule with the guidance of capable advisors, as all wise monarchs do. Evelyn met his eyes. Unless you're suggesting I have ambitions beyond my station? I'm suggesting that ambition doesn't always announce itself. Pemberton's expression was troubled. You've done remarkable work these past months, saved the kingdom, truly. But power has a way of becoming comfortable, easy to justify, and harder to relinquish. I have no intention of relinquishing anything I haven't taken. Evelyn's voice hardened. The king retains all his authority. I've simply ensured he can't abuse it. If that makes the nobles uncomfortable, perhaps they should examine why they prefer a weak king they can manipulate over a strong queen they can't. She walked away before he could respond, but his words lingered. Power becoming comfortable, harder to relinquish. She told herself she was stabilizing the kingdom, protecting it from Adrian's weakness. But was that still true? Or had she started building something new? Something that looked less like a partnership and more like a takeover? The question followed her through the following weeks as she continued working. Meeting with generals, reviewing financial reports, walking among the common people, and listening to their concerns. Every day she made decisions that should have been Adrian's. Every day the distance between them grew wider. And every day she cared less about closing it. The breaking point came during a state dinner with ambassadors from the Eastern Kingdoms. It was meant to be a show of strength, a demonstration that Valadorn was stable despite the recent turmoil. Adrian sat at the head of the table, playing his role adequately, if not brilliantly. Evelyn sat to his right, managing the actual diplomacy while he smiled and made pleasantries. Ambassador Constantine from the Eastern Reach was a sharp-eyed man in his 50s who'd been negotiating treaties since before Evelyn was born. He watched the dynamics at the table with interest, noting every time Adrian deferred to Evelyn, every time the ministers looked to her for guidance instead of their king. During a lull in conversation, Constantine leaned toward Evelyn. Forgive my observation, Your Majesty, but you run a tight court. Thank you. The king seems content to let you handle the complexities. The king trusts my judgment. Evelyn kept her voice light. As I trust his. Constantine smiled, not buying it for a second. In my country, we have a saying, a strong woman behind a weak man is still just a woman standing in shadows. But a strong woman beside a broken man? That's a queen positioning for power. Your country sounds cynical, realistic. His eyes were sharp. The question is what you plan to do with that power once you've fully consolidated it. Evelyn could have deflected, could have insisted she had no ambitions beyond supporting her husband. Instead, she met Constantine's gaze directly and told him the truth. I plan to use it to keep this kingdom standing. Whether that requires shadows or spotlights is irrelevant. He laughed, genuinely amused. I like you, Queen Evelyn. You're the most dangerous person in this room, and you don't even try to hide it. Should I? No. Dangerous women who hide are the ones you should fear. The honest ones are just effective. The dinner continued, but Evelyn's mind was elsewhere, turning over Constantine's words. Dangerous, effective, positioning for power. All true, all accurate, and none of it bothered her the way it should have. Because somewhere in the months since Adrian's betrayal, she'd stopped trying to save their marriage and started trying to save herself. And that meant building power structures that didn't depend on him, creating loyalty networks that answered to her, becoming the kind of queen who could rule alone if necessary. The thought should have scared her. Instead, it felt like freedom. Late that night, unable to sleep, Evelyn walked through the palace gardens. The air was cold and sharp, cutting through her cloak, but she welcomed the discomfort. It helped clear her head. She found Adrian sitting on a bench near the rose garden, holding an empty wine bottle and staring at nothing. You're drunk, she observed. Not yet, but I'm working on it. He gestured at the bottle. Want to help? No, didn't think so. He laughed bitterly. You're too disciplined for messy feelings, too controlled. Someone has to be. That's the problem, though, isn't it? You've become so good at controlling everything that there's no room left for anything else. No weakness, no vulnerability, just perfect, cold competence. You say that like it's a bad thing. It's a lonely thing. Adrian looked up at her. I destroyed us, Evelyn. I know that. But you're the one who salted the earth so nothing could ever grow there again. The accusation hung between them, sharp and true. Evelyn could have argued, could have pointed out that she'd done what was necessary. Instead, she sat down beside him on the bench, maintaining distance but accepting the conversation. What did you want me to do? She asked quietly. Forgive you? Take you back? Pretend the last 6 months didn't happen? I wanted you to feel something, anything. Instead, you just became more efficient at destroying your enemies. Celine wasn't my enemy until she tried to take what was mine. The kingdom? You, the position, the power, all of it. Evelyn's voice was steady. She thought she could seduce a king and inherit an empire. I showed her she was wrong, by becoming exactly what she feared. A queen who doesn't need her king. The words landed like a blade between ribs. Evelyn felt them settle, recognizing truth. She'd spent months proving she could rule without Adrian, making herself indispensable while making him increasingly irrelevant. It had been strategic, necessary, but it had also been intentional. Maybe that's what I needed to become, she said finally, strong enough to stand alone. And what happens when you're done standing? When the kingdom is stable and the threats are gone and you're just left with power you fought so hard to keep? Will it be enough? I don't know. Evelyn met his eyes. But it's better than being powerless while the man I love chose someone else. Adrian flinched. I'm sorry, for all of it. For being weak when you needed me strong. For choosing badly. For making you into something harder than you should have had to become. I'm not sorry. Her voice was cold. Because this version of me survives. The old version would have been destroyed by what you did. So if I'm harder now, if I'm colder, that's the price of survival, and I'm willing to pay it. Even if it costs you everything else. I already lost everything else. She stood, brushing invisible dust from her cloak. Now I'm just making sure I never lose again. She left him sitting in the garden, alone with his guilt and his wine, and felt nothing. No regret, no sadness. Just the cold certainty that she'd crossed some invisible line and there was no going back. The woman who'd married Adrian Hale 12 years ago was gone, killed by betrayal and resurrected as something sharper. More dangerous, less human. Queen Evelyn Carter had learned the most important lesson. Power teaches. Mercy is a luxury afforded to people who can survive without it, and she could no longer afford to be merciful. The following morning brought news that shattered the fragile stability they'd built. General Trent's forces at the northern border had been attacked, not by a foreign army, but by rebels. Valadorn's own people, radicalized by months of neglect and suffering during Adrian's distraction, now rising up against the crown they no longer trusted. The council convened an emergency session. Maps were spread across tables. Generals argued about troop deployments. Ministers debated whether this was an isolated incident or the beginning of widespread revolt. Adrian looked lost, overwhelmed by the scope of the crisis. Hayes turned to Evelyn. Your Majesty, recommendations? Evelyn studied the maps, her mind calculating distances and logistics and political ramifications with cold efficiency. Send word to General Trent that he has full authority to suppress the rebellion using whatever force necessary. Simultaneously, dispatch ministers to the affected provinces with immediate relief. Food, medicine, tax forgiveness. We need to prove the crown hasn't abandoned them. That could be seen as rewarding rebellion, Thornwick protested. Or it could be seen as a king finally paying attention to his people's suffering. Evelyn's voice was sharp. The rebels aren't wrong that they were neglected. We just can't let them destroy the kingdom while we fix our mistakes. Adrian stirred. How much will this cost? Everything. Evelyn met his eyes. Every reserve we have, every favor we're owed, every bit of political capital we've built. We're betting the entire kingdom that we can put out this fire before it spreads. And if we can't, then we lose. Crown, kingdom, everything. Her voice was matter of fact. But the alternative is doing nothing and watching it burn anyway. At least this way we die trying. The room went silent. Every minister, every advisor, Every military commander recognized the stakes. This was the moment, the culmination of months of bad decisions and their cascading consequences. Win or lose, nothing would be the same after this. Adrian stood slowly, and for the first time in months, he looked like a king. Do it. All of it. Whatever the queen recommends, implement immediately. It was surrender disguised as leadership, an admission that his wife was the only thing standing between the kingdom and collapse, and everyone in the room knew it. Evelyn felt the weight of absolute power settle on her shoulders like a crown made of iron. This was what she'd been building toward. The moment when her authority became undeniable, when even Adrian had to admit she was the only one capable of saving them. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she just felt tired. Because she'd won. Decisively. Completely. She'd destroyed her rival, diminished her husband, and consolidated power until she was the single most important person in the kingdom. But victory tasted like ashes, and all she'd sacrificed to get here. The meeting adjourned, and the ministers scattered to implement her orders. Evelyn remained at the table, staring at the maps, seeing not just geography, but the future unfolding in all its brutal complexity. This was just the beginning. The rebellion would be crushed, or it would spread. The kingdom would survive, or it would fracture. And through it all, she would stand at the center, making impossible choices with no good outcomes. Adrian approached slowly. You've become what the kingdom needs. Yes, but not what I needed. No. Her voice was quiet. That ship sailed months ago. I know. He placed something on the table between them. His signet ring, the symbol of royal authority that every king wore. Take it. Evelyn stared at the ring. What are you doing? I'm giving you what you've already taken. Real power, not just the appearance of it. He pushed it toward her. You're the one making the decisions anyway. You might as well have the authority to match. I'm not the king. No. But you're the only thing keeping this kingdom from tearing itself apart. So take the ring. Use it. Rule in everything but name. Adrian's voice was hollow. I'll still sit on the throne, still play the part in public, but we both know who's really in control. Evelyn looked at the ring, gleaming in the candlelight, and recognized the offer for what it was. Not partnership, not trust. Abdication. Adrian was handing her the keys to the kingdom because he no longer had the strength to hold them himself. She could refuse, could insist they maintain the pretense of shared rule. But that would be a lie, and they'd both lived with enough lies. Her hand closed around the ring. The weight of Adrian's signet ring against Evelyn's palm felt heavier than gold had any right to be. She stood alone in the council chamber after everyone had left, turning the band between her fingers, watching candlelight catch the royal seal etched into its surface. 3 generations of kings had worn this ring. Now it belonged to a queen who'd never been meant to rule. She should have felt victorious. Instead, she felt like she'd won a war only to discover the prize was a kingdom on fire. The door opened without warning. Marguerite entered, her face pale and drawn in a way that made Evelyn's instincts flare with alarm. What happened? We have a problem. Marguerite's voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she passed over a sealed letter. This arrived an hour ago, courier from the northern provinces. He refused to give it to anyone but you. Evelyn broke the seal and read. Her expression didn't change, but something cold slithered down her spine as the words registered. The rebellion at the northern border wasn't what they thought. It wasn't desperate farmers pushed to violence by neglect. It was organized, funded, led by someone with military training and intimate knowledge of Valadorn's defensive weaknesses. Someone from inside the palace. Who else has seen this? Evelyn asked quietly. Just me and the courier. He's being held in the Eastern Guardhouse under watch. Keep him there. No visitors, no messages. And find out who he spoke to before reaching the palace. Your Majesty, if there's a traitor in the court, then we need to identify them before they realize we know. Evelyn's mind was already moving through possibilities, calculating threats and vulnerabilities with mechanical precision. Call an emergency council session. Tell no one why. And send word to General Trent that any prisoner captured from the rebel forces should be kept alive for questioning. Marguerite hesitated. What are you thinking? That we've been so focused on external threats we missed the knife pointed at our backs. After Marguerite left, Evelyn read the letter again, memorizing every detail. The rebels had inside information about troop movements, supply routes, and defensive positions that should have been classified. Someone high-ranking enough to access military intelligence was feeding information to enemies of the crown, which meant every decision she'd made, every strategy she'd implemented, had potentially been compromised from the start. The paranoia that came with absolute power settled over her like a second skin. Everyone became a suspect, every ally a potential traitor. She'd spent months building networks of loyalty only to discover one of those threads might be a noose waiting to tighten. She needed to move carefully, reveal nothing, trust no one, not even Adrian, especially not Adrian. The emergency council session convened an hour later. Every minister and advisor gathered around the long table, confusion evident on their faces. Adrian arrived last, looking annoyed at being summoned without explanation. "This better be important," he said. "I was meeting with the Eastern ambassadors." "It's important." Evelyn remained standing while everyone else sat, a subtle assertion of dominance. "We have intelligence suggesting the Northern Rebellion is being coordinated from inside the palace." The room erupted. Voices talking over each other, denials and accusations flying in equal measure. Lord Hayes stood so quickly his chair toppled backward. "That's impossible. Who would—" "That's what we're going to determine." Evelyn's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Someone with access to classified military information has been feeding intelligence to rebel forces, which means everyone in this room is a suspect until proven otherwise." Adrian's face went dark. "You can't seriously think one of us would commit treason. I think someone desperate or greedy enough might consider it." Evelyn met his eyes across the table. "We've all seen what corruption looks like in this court. Celine wasn't the only one willing to profit from chaos. So what? We're all under investigation now?" Thornwick's face was redder than usual, his voice defensive. "You're going to interrogate your own counsel based on a single letter? I'm going to protect this kingdom from whoever is trying to destroy it." Evelyn's voice was ice, starting with a full audit of everyone who had access to military intelligence over the past 3 months. Documents, communications, financial records, everything. The ministers shifted uncomfortably. Nobody wanted their private affairs examined, even those with nothing to hide. Privacy was currency in the palace. Information meant leverage, and Evelyn was demanding they hand over both. General Trent spoke up from his position at the far end. "Your Majesty, if I may, the rebels have been using tactics that suggest formal military training, not just strategy, but specific formations and maneuvers used by our own forces. Whoever is advising them either served in the army or had direct access to our tactical documentation." "How many people fit that description?" Evelyn asked. "In this room?" 3. Myself, Lord Commander Pierce, and Master Hayes, who served as a tactical advisor during the Eastern campaigns 20 years ago. Hayes bristled. "I've served this crown faithfully for 40 years. How dare you? No one is accusing anyone yet." Evelyn's voice was calm but carried absolute authority. "We're simply gathering information. General, I want a list of everyone who accessed military documents in the past 6 months. Commander Pierce, assign your most trusted officers to quietly investigate anyone on that list. And someone find out who benefited financially from the instability Celine created during her time at court, because that's where the thread would lead. Follow the money. Find who profited from chaos. Discover who had motive to keep the kingdom unstable even after Celine was gone." Adrian cleared his throat. "You're forgetting something. If there is a traitor, they now know we're looking for them. You just showed our hand." "No!" Evelyn turned to face him fully. "I just flushed them out. Whoever is responsible will now make a move, either to cover their tracks or eliminate evidence. And when they do, we'll be watching." It was a gamble, the kind of calculated risk she'd become comfortable making. But gambles only worked if you could control the variables. And Evelyn was rapidly discovering there were too many variables she couldn't see. The session ended with assignments distributed and suspicion thick enough to choke on. Nobody trusted anyone. Every glance carried accusation. Every conversation became a potential interrogation. Exactly what Evelyn needed. Chaos made people careless, and careless people made mistakes. She was in her study 3 hours later, reviewing financial records when Marcus appeared in the doorway. The young guard who'd been Celine's ally now worked directly for Evelyn, his loyalty purchased with the promise of advancement and the implicit threat of what happened to those who betrayed her. "Your Majesty." He looked nervous. You asked me to monitor unusual activity. And Lord Pemberton met with someone in the Eastern Gardens an hour ago. Private conversation, no attendance. The other person kept their face covered, but their height and build suggest it was a woman. Did you hear what was discussed? No, but Pemberton passed them a sealed envelope. They left immediately after through the servants' entrance. Evelyn's mind sharpened. Pemberton, the oldest and most respected noble in the kingdom, the man who'd warned her about accumulating too much power. If he was involved in treason, it wasn't for money. It was ideological, a belief that she'd become too dangerous, that removing her was the only way to restore proper order. Follow him, she said quietly. Document everyone he meets with, every conversation, every letter, but don't let him know he's being watched. Yes, Your Majesty. And Marcus? If you betray me the way you betrayed Celine, I won't send you into exile. I'll have you executed for treason. Are we clear? His face went pale. Crystal clear, Your Majesty. After he left, Evelyn sat alone in the gathering darkness, the pieces finally starting to align. Pemberton had opposed Adrian's affair with Celine, but he'd also been one of the first to express concern about Evelyn's growing power. He'd served under Adrian's father, remembered when queens were ornamental rather than operational. The idea of a woman wielding real authority would be anathema to someone like him. But treason? That required proof. Evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. And she needed to be absolutely certain before making accusations that could fracture the court beyond repair. She was still thinking through strategies when Adrian entered without knocking, his face flushed with wine and anger. You humiliated me today, he said, in front of the entire council, made me look weak. You are weak. Evelyn didn't bother looking up from her papers. That's why I'm the one making the decisions. You've become ruthless. He moved closer, his voice rising. This obsession with control, with rooting out traitors, you're destroying what little trust remains in this court. Trust is a luxury we can't afford. She finally met his eyes. Someone is actively working to destroy this kingdom, and you're worried about hurt feelings. I'm worried about my wife turning into a tyrant. The word hung between them, sharp and accusatory. Evelyn stood slowly, her expression cold enough to freeze blood. A tyrant is someone who rules through fear for their own benefit. I'm ruling through necessity for the kingdom's survival. If you can't tell the difference, that explains why you nearly destroyed everything 6 months ago. That's not fair, Sal. None of this is fair. Evelyn's voice rose for the first time in months, the careful control cracking just enough to show the rage beneath. You fell in love with a woman who was looting the treasury. You appointed her to positions she wasn't qualified for. You ignored your duties while the kingdom suffered. And now when I'm trying to fix the catastrophe you created, you have the audacity to call me a tyrant? Adrian flinched like she'd struck him. I know I made mistakes. Mistakes get people killed. Your mistakes nearly cost us everything. She moved around the desk to face him directly. So yes, I've become ruthless. Because someone has to be. Someone has to make the hard choices while you're busy feeling sorry for yourself. I never wanted this. His voice broke. Any of this. Neither did I. But here we are. They stared at each other across the space that had become a chasm, and Evelyn saw in his eyes the final death of whatever they'd once been. Not love, not partnership, not even mutual respect. Just two people trapped in roles they could no longer escape, bound by duty to a kingdom that was tearing itself apart. Adrian left without another word. Evelyn returned to her desk, and the papers spread across it, her hands perfectly steady, her mind already moving past the confrontation to the next problem, the next threat, the next decision that would cost her another piece of her humanity. Because she'd learned the fundamental truth of absolute power. The more you had, the more you needed. The stronger you became, the more dangerous everyone else looked. Until eventually you were standing alone at the top of a mountain made of corpses, wondering when you'd stopped being the hero and started being the villain. But she couldn't afford those thoughts. Not now. Not when the kingdom was balanced on a knife's edge, and she was the only thing keeping it from falling. The break came 3 days later. Commander Pierce arrested Lord Pemberton in the middle of a council session, soldiers surrounding him before he could react. The old noble's face went white as Pierce placed documents on the table in front of Evelyn, financial records showing payments to known rebel sympathizers, letters coordinating supply disruptions. and a detailed plan outlining how to use the Northern Rebellion to force Evelyn from power by making her look incompetent at crisis management. Pemberton hadn't wanted to destroy the kingdom. He'd wanted to save it from what he perceived as a greater threat. Her. Evelyn read through the evidence with clinical detachment, her expression never changing even as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. Pemberton had been feeding information to rebels not to help them win, but to create just enough chaos to justify her removal. He'd calculated that a small controlled crisis was better than letting her accumulate unchecked power. He'd been trying to save the kingdom from a tyrant. The irony wasn't lost on her. "This is treason," Adrian said quietly. He looked shaken, as if discovering corruption in someone he'd trusted for years had broken something fundamental in his worldview. Pemberton finally found his voice. "I did what I believed was necessary. Your Majesty, you've accumulated more power than any queen in history. You override the king. You control the military. You've made yourself indispensable while making him irrelevant. Someone had to stop you before... Before what?" Evelyn's voice was soft. "Before I saved the kingdom, you were actively sabotaging? I was trying to restore balance." Pemberton's voice shook with conviction. "Your husband made mistakes, yes, but you've turned those mistakes into justification for absolute control. You're not a queen anymore. You're a despot in waiting. And you decided civil war was preferable to my leadership. I decided temporary instability was preferable to permanent tyranny." The room was silent. Every minister, every advisor, hung on the next words out of Evelyn's mouth. This was the moment. The choice that would define not just the immediate crisis, but the future of the crown itself. She could have Pemberton executed, make an example of him, prove that betrayal would be met with overwhelming force. It would cement her authority, eliminate her most vocal critic, and send a clear message that opposition would not be tolerated. It would also prove him right. Or she could show mercy. Demonstrate that power didn't require cruelty, that strength could coexist with wisdom. It would make her look weak to some, but it would also prove she wasn't the tyrant he feared. But mercy was dangerous. Weakness invited further challenges. And she'd already learned the cost of being underestimated. Evelyn looked at the old noble who'd served the crown faithfully for 40 years before deciding she was a threat worth committing treason to stop. She saw in his eyes not greed or malice, but genuine conviction. He believed he was saving the kingdom. He was also responsible for deaths. Soldiers killed in rebel attacks he'd enabled. Civilians caught in violence he'd orchestrated. Whatever his motives, his actions had consequences. "Lord Pemberton," she said quietly. "You're right." The room erupted. Adrian stood from his throne. Evelyn held up a hand for silence. "You're right that I've accumulated unprecedented power. You're right that I've diminished the king's authority. You're right that my control is absolute in ways that should terrify anyone who understands history." Her voice was steady. "You're only wrong about one thing. I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing it because the alternative is watching this kingdom collapse under the weight of incompetence and corruption." "That doesn't justify tyranny," Pemberton said. "No, it doesn't." Evelyn moved closer to him. "But here's what you didn't understand. I never wanted this power. I took it because someone had to, because the man who was supposed to lead us was too distracted by his own desires to notice the kingdom burning. I became what the kingdom needed, not what I wanted to be." "So you admit you're a tyrant." "I admit I'm willing to be whatever keeps these people alive. If that makes me a tyrant in your eyes, so be it. But at least I'm a tyrant who feeds her people instead of letting them starve while the king chases pretty women." Adrian made a choked sound but didn't speak. Evelyn turned to Commander Pierce. "Lord Pemberton will be held under house arrest pending trial. His titles remain intact, but his authority is suspended. Anyone he colluded with will face the same. And the investigation continues until we've identified every thread of this conspiracy." "You're not executing him?" Pierce looked surprised. "No." Evelyn met Pemberton's eyes. "Because he's not entirely wrong, and killing him would make me the monster he thinks I am." She left the council chamber to stunned silence, Adrian's signet ring heavy on her finger, and the weight of absolute power crushing down on shoulders that were starting to bend under the strain. Because Pemberton's words had struck bone. She'd become exactly what she'd spent her life avoiding. Not a queen, a despot, someone who justified every brutal choice with noble intentions until she couldn't tell the difference anymore between protecting the kingdom and feeding her own need for control. The line between savior and tyrant was thinner than she'd ever imagined, and she'd been walking it for months without realizing she'd already crossed to the wrong side. Marguerite found her an hour later in the palace chapel, a place Evelyn rarely visited but needed the silence of. The old woman sat beside her on the cold stone bench. "You showed mercy. I showed weakness." "No." Marguerite's voice was gentle. "You showed you're still human. That power hasn't completely consumed you. Yet." Evelyn stared at the altar ahead. "Give it time." "What will you do now?" "What I have to. Finish rooting out the conspirators, stabilize the kingdom, keep everyone alive despite themselves." She paused. "And figure out who I am when this is over. If it's ever over." "Yes. If." Because that was the trap of absolute power. Once you had it, you couldn't let go without risking everything you'd built. The moment she released control, someone else would seize it. Probably someone less competent. Possibly someone more corrupt. And all the sacrifices she'd made would be for nothing. So she had to hold on. Had to keep making brutal choices. Had to become harder and colder and more ruthless until there was nothing left of the woman who'd once believed in love and partnership and shared rule. Pemberton had been right about one thing. She was becoming a tyrant. The only question was whether the kingdom she saved would be worth the cost of what she'd become. The trial lasted 3 days and revealed a conspiracy larger than anyone had imagined. 12 nobles had been involved in Pemberton's plot, including 2 ministers and a high-ranking military officer. Some genuinely believed they were stopping a tyrant. Others had simply seen opportunity in chaos and taken it. Evelyn sat through every testimony, her face carved from marble, as witness after witness detailed the scope of the betrayal, how they'd fed information to rebels, how they'd coordinated supply disruptions, how they'd planned to use the crisis to force her into abdication by making it look like her policies had failed. It was brilliant strategy. It also got 73 soldiers killed and displaced thousands of civilians. The verdicts came swiftly. House arrest for Pemberton and the ideological conspirators. Execution for those who'd profited financially from treason. The military officer who'd provided tactical intelligence to rebels was stripped of rank and imprisoned for life. Evelyn signed each sentence with Adrian's ring, her hand steady, feeling another piece of her soul detach and drift away into darkness. She was in her chambers late that night when Adrian finally came to her. Not angry this time, just tired and broken, and looking for something he couldn't name. "You were right," he said quietly, "about everything. Celine. My weakness. The kingdom needing someone stronger." "Yes." Evelyn didn't turn from the window. "I was. So why don't you look victorious? Because winning feels like losing when you have to become someone you hate to do it." Adrian moved to stand beside her, both of them staring out at the Capitol below. Thousands of lights flickering in the darkness. Lives continuing despite the chaos at the palace. People who had no idea their queen was currently questioning whether she'd saved them or just enslaved them more efficiently. "I've been thinking," Adrian said, "about what happens next. We stabilize the kingdom, root out any remaining conspirators, rebuild trust." "No, I mean with us." "There is no us. We've been through this. I know, but that doesn't mean we can't rebuild something. Not love, maybe, but partnership. The way we should have been operating all along." Evelyn laughed, sharp and bitter. "You want partnership now? After I've spent 6 months proving I don't need you? Maybe that's exactly when partnership matters most. When both people are strong enough to stand alone but choose not to." His voice was quiet. "I abdicated, Evelyn. I gave you the ring and the power because I was too weak to hold them. But watching you struggle with the weight of absolute authority, seeing what it's costing you, I realize I made another mistake." "What mistake?" "Leaving you alone at the top. Because nobody should have to carry that burden by themselves. Not even someone as strong as you." The words settled between them, genuine and vulnerable in ways Adrian hadn't been in years. Evelyn wanted to reject them. To tell him he'd lost the right to offer support when he'd chosen Celine. But she was so tired. Tired of being hard, tired of making brutal choices alone. Tired of wondering if every decision was turning her into the tyrant Pemberton feared. "I don't know how to not do this alone anymore," she admitted quietly. I don't know how to trust anyone with this much power. You don't have to trust me with the power, just with the burden of carrying it. She turned to look at him finally. He looked older, worn down by guilt and consequences, but there was something in his eyes she recognized from years ago. Before Celine, before the betrayal. A man who understood responsibility and was finally ready to share it. It wouldn't be a marriage, wouldn't be love, but it might be survival. Two people strong enough to stand alone choosing to stand together because the alternative was slowly being crushed under the weight of a crown neither of them had been fully prepared to wear. Tell me about the trade negotiations with the Eastern Kingdoms, she said finally. The real status, not what you told the council. Adrian blinked, surprised by the subject change, then understood. This was the test. Proof he was serious about partnership rather than making empty promises. They're worse than we've admitted publicly. The Eastern Reach is demanding territorial concessions in exchange for continued trade. They think we're weak right now, and they're not wrong. And you didn't tell me because I was embarrassed that I'd let things deteriorate that far during my distraction. He met her eyes. But you need to know, we have maybe 2 months before they cut off trade routes entirely, which would devastate our economy. Options? Give them what they want, prepare for war, or find leverage that makes them reconsider. Adrian paused. I've been working on option 3. There's a scandal involving one of their princes. If we threaten to make it public, you've been working diplomatic blackmail behind my back? Is that partnership or overstepping? Evelyn considered. 6 months ago, she would have been furious at the independence. Now she was just relieved to not be carrying every burden alone. It's partnership, she said finally. Brief me on the details tomorrow. We'll strategize together. Something eased in Adrian's expression. Not relief exactly. More like recognition that maybe, possibly, they could find a way forward that didn't require one of them to be completely powerless while the other drowned in authority. They stood together at the window watching the capital sleep, two people who'd broken each other and been broken in turn, trying to figure out if shattered pieces could be reassembled into something functional, if not beautiful. It was Marguerite who brought the news 3 days later that shattered the fragile stability they'd been building. She burst into the council chamber mid-session, her face pale and her hands shaking in ways Evelyn had never seen. Your Majesty. She could barely get the words out. Celine Voss. She's dead. The room went silent. Evelyn felt something cold settle in her stomach. How? Suicide. Marguerite's voice cracked. She hanged herself in her estate in the southern provinces 2 nights ago. A servant found her this morning. Adrian made a choked sound. Someone handed him wine and he drank mechanically, his face gray. Evelyn's mind was racing through implications and consequences and the nauseating realization that this changed everything. Celine hadn't been just an exile, she'd been a warning, a living example of what happened when you cross the crown. Now she was a martyr, a beautiful woman driven to suicide by a jealous queen. The narrative would write itself. Is there a note? Evelyn asked quietly. Marguerite hesitated. Yes, it's addressed to the king. Bring it to me first. Your Majesty, bring it to me. The letter arrived an hour later. Evelyn read it alone in her study, and with each line felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Celine's final words were perfectly calculated to inflict maximum damage. She wrote of unrequited love and cruel exile, of a queen who couldn't bear to see her husband happy, of choosing death over living without the man she loved. It was manipulation from beyond the grave, and it was going to work, because people would believe it. They'd see a tragic romance destroyed by a bitter queen. They'd forget the theft and corruption, forget that Celine had nearly destroyed the kingdom. They'd only remember a beautiful woman who loved a king and died heartbroken. Evelyn burned the letter. Then she called for Commander Pierce and issued orders that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The official story would be that Celine had died of illness. No mention of suicide, no romantic tragedy, just a quiet death that barely warranted notice. It was a lie. Another brutal choice. Another piece of her soul traded for stability. But when Adrian demanded to see the note, and she looked him in the eyes and told him it had said nothing important, just rambling grief, she watched him believe her because he needed to, because the truth would destroy what little he'd managed to rebuild. She'd crossed another line. This one felt more permanent than all the others. That night, alone in her chambers, Evelyn finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she'd become. Not a queen, not a tyrant, something worse. Someone who lied to the person she'd once loved most to protect a kingdom that might not deserve protecting anymore. She looked at Adrian's signet ring on her finger and understood with perfect clarity that Pemberton had been right all along. Power hadn't corrupted her. It had revealed who she'd always been underneath the carefully constructed facade of dutiful wife and patient queen, someone willing to sacrifice anything, do anything, become anything, as long as she stayed standing at the end. The realization should have horrified her. Instead, it just felt like finally admitting a truth she'd been avoiding for months. She was the villain of this story, had been since the moment she'd chosen survival over mercy. And there was no going back to being the hero because heroes didn't burn letters from dead women. Heroes didn't manipulate grieving husbands. Heroes didn't consolidate absolute power and call it necessary. The woman she'd been 12 months ago was as dead as Celine, killed by betrayal and resurrected as something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. And the worst part was knowing she'd make the same choices again if faced with them. Because the kingdom needed someone willing to get blood on their hands, someone who wouldn't flinch from brutal decisions, someone who could carry the weight of absolute power without breaking under it, even if carrying that weight meant losing every part of herself that had once been worth saving. The morning Evelyn woke to find the palace surrounded was the morning she understood that power, no matter how absolute, was still just an illusion maintained by the consent of those you ruled. The sounds reached her chambers before the news did. Not the usual morning rhythms of a functioning palace, but something harder, more organized. Boots on stone, metal scraping metal, the low rumble of many voices unified by single purpose. She was at the window before Marguerite burst through the door. "They're here." The old woman's face was ashen. General Trent's forces, 10,000 soldiers surrounding the palace. "He's demanding you surrender your authority, or he'll take it by force." Evelyn's mind went cold and clear. No panic, no fear. Just the mechanical calculation of someone who'd been preparing for this moment without knowing it. "How long do we have?" "He's given you until noon, 3 hours." "Where's Adrian?" "With the council. They're debating whether to comply." "Of course they are." Evelyn pulled on her formal robes, the heavy ones embroidered with gold thread and the royal seal. If she was going to fall, she'd do it looking like a queen. "Get Commander Pierce. I want a full assessment of our defensive capabilities, and I want it in 10 minutes. Your Majesty, we can't fight the entire Northern Army." "I'm not planning to fight them. I'm planning to understand exactly how desperate our situation is before I make decisions." After Marguerite left, Evelyn stood alone for 30 seconds, allowing herself one moment of raw feeling before locking it away. Trent had been loyal. She'd counted on that loyalty, built strategies around it. The realization that he'd turned meant her judgment was compromised. She'd missed something. Some sign that the general she'd trusted was actually watching her accumulate power and deciding she'd become the greater threat. Pemberton's warning echoed in her skull. Tyrant, despot, someone who needed to be stopped. Apparently Trent agreed. She made it to the council chamber to find chaos. Ministers shouting over each other, some demanding immediate surrender, others calling it treason to even consider compliance. Adrian sat at the head of the table looking overwhelmed, his face gray, the weight of actual crisis crushing down on shoulders that had been allowed to remain weak for too long. He saw her enter and something shifted in his expression. Relief mixed with dread. She'd become the person everyone looked to when things fell apart, which meant she was also the person everyone would blame when solutions required blood. "What's the assessment?" she asked Commander Pierce. "Not good." He spread a map across the table. Trent has the palace completely encircled. 10,000 soldiers, most of them veterans from the northern campaigns. We have maybe 300 guards inside the palace walls, and another 500 scattered throughout the capital. Even if we could rally them all, we're outnumbered 20 to 1. What about the eastern legions? Can we call for reinforcement? Not in time. They're 3 days' march away minimum. Trent planned this carefully. Hit us when we're isolated and vulnerable. Then we negotiate. Lord Hayes's voice was shaking. "We give General Trent what he wants and avoid bloodshed." "What he wants is my head," Evelyn said flatly. "Be specific about what you're suggesting we surrender. Your authority. Your position." Hayes couldn't meet her eyes. He's not demanding your execution, just your removal from power. He says you've exceeded the bounds of your station and accumulated authority that was never meant to be held by a queen. If you step down voluntarily, he'll allow you to retain your title and live out your days in comfortable exile. How generous. Evelyn's voice was cold enough to freeze blood. And once I'm gone, who rules? Adrian? The same man who nearly destroyed this kingdom 6 months ago? Or will Trent conveniently decide the king needs military oversight to prevent future crises? The room went silent. Everyone understood the implications. This wasn't about restoring balance. It was a military coup dressed up as intervention. Trent was using legitimate concerns about her authority as cover for seizing power himself. We have no good options, Thornwick said quietly. If we fight, people die. If we surrender, we're admitting the crown can be intimidated by any general with enough soldiers. There's a third option. Adrian spoke for the first time, his voice steady in ways Evelyn hadn't heard in months. We call his bluff. Everyone turned to stare at him. Trent is gambling that we'll surrender rather than fight because he knows the optics of the military attacking the palace are terrible. It makes him look like a tyrant seizing power. But if we refuse to be intimidated, if we stand firm and force him to make the first move, he either backs down or reveals himself as exactly what he is, a traitor committing treason. And if he doesn't back down, Hayes demanded, if he orders his forces to storm the palace, then we fight. Adrian met Evelyn's eyes across the table, and she saw something in his expression that reminded her why she'd married him 12 years ago. Not love, not passion, but the iron core of someone who understood that some battles couldn't be avoided. We fight, and we make it cost him everything. Because even if we lose, the historical record will be clear. The military attacked the rightful rulers of Valadorn, and the entire kingdom will remember. It was suicide dressed as strategy. A gamble that assumed Trent cared more about legacy than power. And Evelyn knew with cold certainty that it wouldn't work. Trent hadn't surrounded the palace to negotiate. He'd come to win. But Adrian was right about one thing. They couldn't surrender, because surrendering meant admitting the crown could be taken by anyone with enough force. It meant every future crisis would be solved with military intervention. It meant the end of civilian rule and the beginning of something darker. Better to fight and lose than kneel and prove they were never worthy of the crown to begin with. I agree, Evelyn said quietly. We stand firm. The ministers erupted in protest, but she spoke over them. Commander Pierce, fortify all entrances. Position archers on the walls. If Trent wants this palace, he'll have to take it by force. Hayes, draft a proclamation declaring Trent's actions treasonous and offering clemency to any soldier who refuses his orders. Thornwick, open the royal vaults. Any citizen willing to fight for the crown gets paid in gold. Your Majesty, that's our only chance. Evelyn's voice was absolute. Trent is betting the common people won't risk themselves for a queen they barely know. We prove him wrong by showing them the crown is worth defending. She left the council chamber before anyone could argue, her mind already working through logistics and contingencies. 3 hours until Trent's deadline. Not enough time to fundamentally change their position, but enough to make a stand that would be remembered. She found Adrian in the corridor outside, waiting for her. That was either brilliant or insane, he said. Probably both. She kept walking, forcing him to follow. You realize what you committed us to. If we're wrong, if Trent doesn't back down, people will die defending a queen most of them resent. I know. And you're comfortable with that? No. Adrian's voice was quiet. But I'm less comfortable with the alternative. You were right about power, Evelyn. Once you have it, you can't afford to look weak. The moment we surrender to military pressure is the moment the crown becomes meaningless. So we die for symbolism. We die proving the crown still matters. They reached the eastern battlements where Commander Pierce was positioning archers. The view from the walls showed exactly how desperate their situation was. Trent's forces stretched in every direction, organized into tight formations, siege equipment being assembled in the distance. 10,000 soldiers who'd fought and bled for the kingdom now preparing to attack the palace they'd sworn to protect. Evelyn scanned the faces below and recognized some of them. Veterans she'd ensured were paid during the crisis. Soldiers who'd received supplies she'd fought to allocate. Men who should have been loyal but had followed their general instead because military bonds ran deeper than political gratitude. She'd miscalculated. Thought competence and fairness would be enough to earn lasting loyalty. But soldiers followed strength, and Trent represented something she couldn't compete with: a return to traditional order, a kingdom ruled by men who understood violence instead of women who'd seized power during crisis. The horn sounded at 11. Not the deadline, but close enough to make the point. Trent himself rode forward on a massive warhorse, stopping just outside bow range. He was dressed in full military regalia, every inch the conquering general, his face visible even at this distance. Queen Evelyn, his voice carried across the space between them, amplified by training and authority. I'm offering you one final chance to surrender peacefully. Step down from your position, relinquish the authority you've claimed, and this ends without bloodshed. Evelyn moved to the edge of the battlements where everyone could see her. She wore no armor, just her formal robes and Adrian's signet ring catching sunlight. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady. General Trent, you've surrounded the palace with forces sworn to protect the crown. You've issued ultimatums to your queen, and you've committed treason against the kingdom you claim to serve. I'm offering you one chance to stand down, return to your post, and face judgment through proper legal channels. If you refuse, history will remember you as the general who attacked his own people because a woman's authority threatened your pride. The soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked uncertain, others grimly determined, but none broke ranks. Trent's expression didn't change. You've had absolute power for 6 months and used it to diminish the king, eliminate political opponents, and consolidate authority no queen was ever meant to hold. You're not protecting the kingdom, you're destroying it from within. I'm doing what's necessary to restore proper order. Proper order. Evelyn's voice hardened. You mean the order where men make decisions and women stand silent? Where military force determines right and wrong? Where any general uncomfortable with civilian oversight can simply surround the palace and demand compliance? I mean the order where kings rule and queens support them. Where power is balanced and authority is earned through legitimate succession, not seized during crisis. I didn't seize anything. Adrian appeared beside Evelyn, his voice carrying across the battlefield. I gave it to her. Because she was competent when I was weak. Because she saved the kingdom when I nearly destroyed it. And because she's the only person in Valadorn capable of the brutally hard choices that leadership requires. Then you're as much a traitor to your crown as she is, Trent shot back. A king who abdicates his authority deserves neither loyalty nor respect. The words hit like arrows. Evelyn felt Adrian flinch beside her, but he didn't back down. Just stood there, finally accepting responsibility for his choices, even as they damned him. You have until noon, Trent said. Surrender or we attack. Your choice. He rode back to his forces, leaving Evelyn and Adrian standing on the battlements, watching thousands of soldiers prepare for assault. The defenders on the walls numbered maybe 200, veterans and guards who'd stayed loyal either from conviction or lack of better options. It wasn't enough. Wasn't even close. We're going to lose, Adrian said quietly. Yes, but we're not surrendering. No. Evelyn turned to face him. Because the moment we kneel to military force is the moment the crown becomes a puppet. Better to fall and let history judge whether we were tyrants or the last defenders of civilian rule. Will they remember us that way? I don't know. But at least we'll die as ourselves instead of whoever Trent wants us to become. The hour passed too quickly. Evelyn spent it moving through the palace, speaking to defenders, looking them in the eyes and seeing their fear mixed with grim determination. These people had stayed when they could have fled, had chosen the crown over safety. Whatever happened next, their loyalty meant something. She found Marguerite in the throne room, calmly organizing evacuation routes for non-combatants. You should go, Evelyn said. Get out while there's still time. I've served this crown for 50 years. Marguerite's voice was steady. I'm not running now because a general decides he knows better than his queen. You might die here. Then I die serving something worth defending. Evelyn felt something crack in her chest. Not grief, not fear. Something more fundamental. The recognition that she'd spent 6 months becoming someone capable of brutal choices, but had forgotten what those choices were supposed to protect. People like Marguerite who believed the crown represented something beyond just power, an ideal, a promise that civilization could exist without might making right. If we survive this, Evelyn said quietly, remind me why we're fighting. For the kingdom we want to build, not the one we inherited. The horn sounded at noon. No warning, no final negotiation, just the signal followed immediately by the thunder of 10,000 soldiers advancing on the palace walls. Evelyn was on the eastern battlements when the first assault wave hit. Archers fired down into the mass of advancing forces, but there were too many targets and too few arrows. Ladders slammed against stone, grappling hooks caught on parapets. The palace guards fought desperately, pushing back ladders and cutting ropes. But for every soldier they repelled, 3 more took their place. Commander Pierce was bellowing orders, trying to coordinate a defense that was already crumbling. A section of the southern wall fell within minutes, Trent's forces pouring through the breach like water through a cracked dam. This is how empires end, Evelyn thought with strange clarity. Not with grand betrayals or dramatic speeches, just overwhelming force applied by people convinced they're saving what they're actually destroying. Adrian found her on the battlements, his face streaked with dust and sweat. The throne room is breached. We need to fall back to the inner keep. There's no point. She watched more soldiers scaling the walls. We're outnumbered and outmatched. Falling back just delays the inevitable. Then what do you suggest? We end this before more people die for a fight we've already lost. You want to surrender. I want to stop the bleeding. Evelyn turned to face him fully. Trent was right about one thing. I accumulated too much power too quickly, made myself the target. If I'm what he wants, then I'll give him that and maybe the kingdom survives. Absolutely not. Adrian's voice was fierce. We agreed to stand together. We agreed to die rather than kneel to force. We didn't agree to let everyone else die with us. She moved toward the stairs leading down from the battlements. Adrian grabbed her arm, spinning her around. If you surrender now, everything we fought for means nothing. If I don't surrender, people die defending a queen who's already lost. Evelyn pulled her arm free. I can live with being remembered as a tyrant. I can't live with watching loyalty get people killed for no reason. Oskit. She descended the stairs before he could stop her, moving through corridors already echoing with sounds of battle. Soldiers fighting, people screaming, the palace she'd worked so hard to protect coming apart at the seams. Commander Pierce tried to intercept her in the main hall. Your Majesty, we need to evacuate you. Open the gates. What? Open the gates. Let Trent's forces in, and bring me something white to wave as a surrender flag. Pierce looked horrified. You can't. I can and I am. This ends now. But Your Majesty, that's an order, Commander. He hesitated one more second, then saluted sharply, understanding this was the final command he'd received from her. Within minutes, the gates were opening, defenders standing down, and Evelyn was walking into the courtyard alone holding a strip of white cloth torn from a servant's apron. Trent's soldiers flooded through the gates, weapons ready, expecting continued resistance. They pulled up short when they saw her standing there undefended in the center of the courtyard. Trent himself rode through moments later, his face unreadable as he dismounted. Queen Evelyn. General. Her voice was steady. I'm surrendering my authority as you demanded. I'll step down from all positions of power. I'll submit to whatever exile you decree, but you will order your forces to stand down immediately and guarantee the safety of everyone in this palace who remained loyal to the crown. That's non-negotiable. You're not in a position to negotiate anything. No. But you're not in a position to ignore optics. Evelyn gestured at the soldiers surrounding them. You've already conquered the palace. If you slaughter everyone inside, you're not a liberator restoring order. You're a tyrant seizing power. So accept my surrender, let the others live, and you get to be remembered as the general who saved the kingdom instead of the monster who destroyed it. Trent studied her for a long moment. Around them, soldiers shifted uneasily. Some looked relieved, others disappointed. All of them waiting to see which version of history they'd be participating in. You're more dangerous surrendering than fighting, Trent said finally, because now everyone will remember you sacrificed yourself for the kingdom. Then you should have let me die defending it. Would have been simpler for both of us. He almost smiled. Almost. You'll be escorted to the southern provinces under guard. You're forbidden from holding any position of authority or communicating with anyone in the capital. If you violate those terms, the exile becomes imprisonment. Understood? Understood. And the king remains king. Evelyn met his eyes. That was always the point. I never wanted to rule. I just did what was necessary when no one else would. Trent turned to his lieutenants. Stand down. Secure the palace, but no executions, no reprisals. Anyone who fought for the crown did so following orders. They're not traitors, just loyal to the wrong authority. The soldiers began withdrawing, the immediate crisis diffusing as quickly as it had escalated. Evelyn stood in the courtyard, watching her authority dissolve, feeling nothing. Not grief, not anger. Just the hollow recognition that power was always temporary, and she'd held it exactly as long as the men with swords allowed. Adrian appeared on the palace steps, his face stricken. "Don't do this, it's already done. We could have fought, could have..." Chagor died, along with everyone who stayed loyal. This way they live. Evelyn's voice was matter-of-fact. Sometimes the only winning move is surrender. But you saved the kingdom. I earned nothing. I seized power during crisis and called it necessity. Trent was right about that. The only question was whether I'd admit it before or after watching people die for my pride. Adrian descended the steps, moving past soldiers who parted uncertainly. When he reached her, he pulled the signet ring from her finger. "You gave me this 6 months ago because you couldn't carry the weight alone. Now I'm taking it back. Not because you failed, because you succeeded too well and it scared everyone who wanted power to remain predictable and controllable." He pressed the ring into his own palm, then did something unexpected. He knelt, in front of Trent's soldiers, in front of his own guards, in front of the woman who'd just surrendered everything. "You saved me," he said quietly. "You saved the kingdom, and you'll be forgotten for it because that's what happens to people who do what's necessary instead of what's comfortable. But I'll remember. Every day of whatever reign I have left, I'll remember the queen who was strong enough to stand alone and wise enough to kneel when standing would have gotten innocents killed." "Get up." Evelyn's voice was harsh. "You're embarrassing both of us." "Good." Adrian stood but didn't move away. "Because I've spent 6 months being embarrassed by my own weakness. It's time someone else got embarrassed by strength." Trent cleared his throat. "The queen needs to leave. Now, give us a minute." "You don't give orders anymore," General Trent said. "Neither of you." He was right. They were both powerless now, stripped of authority, left with nothing but each other and the ruins of what they'd tried to build. Evelyn met Adrian's eyes and saw her own exhaustion reflected back. Two people who'd broken each other and been broken in turn, finally understanding that some damage couldn't be repaired, only acknowledged. "Thank you," Adrian said simply. "For everything, even the parts that hurt. Especially those parts," Evelyn replied, "because they're the only ones that mattered." The guards escorted her to a waiting carriage. No ceremony, no grand exit, just a quiet removal of the woman who'd ruled absolutely for 6 months and surrendered it all in 6 minutes to save people who'd probably never know what she'd sacrificed. As the carriage rolled through the palace gates, Evelyn looked back once, saw Adrian standing in the courtyard, Trent's soldiers surrounding him, the weight of a crown he'd tried to give away settling back on shoulders that weren't ready. Saw Marguerite on the steps, her face carved from grief. Saw Commander Pierce saluting even though she no longer had rank to deserve it. The palace disappeared behind walls and distance, and Evelyn turned forward, watching the capital slide past the carriage windows. Thousands of people going about their lives, unaware their queen had just fallen. Or maybe aware and relieved. Hard to tell. The southern provinces were 3 days away. Exile in an estate she'd never seen, guarded by soldiers ensuring she stayed forgotten. It should have felt like defeat. Instead, it just felt like finally being allowed to stop carrying weight that was never meant to be held by one person. She'd been a queen for 12 years, a ruler for 6 months, and a cautionary tale for however long people remembered before the next crisis made her irrelevant. But she'd done something Pemberton and Trent and all the men who'd questioned her authority couldn't claim. She'd held absolute power and given it up voluntarily to save lives. Not because she was weak, because she was strong enough to recognize when holding on cost more than letting go. That had to count for something. Even if history forgot everything else, that single choice had to mean she'd been more than just a tyrant in waiting, more than a woman who'd seized power and called it necessity. She'd been someone who understood that true strength wasn't measured by how much power you could take, but by how much you could surrender when the alternative was watching good people die for bad reasons. The carriage rolled south through countryside she'd only seen from palace windows, and Evelyn finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything that had broken and bled over the past year. Not crying, just feeling. The loss of a marriage that had died long before Celine arrived. The cost of choices that had turned her into someone she barely recognized. The strange, hollow relief of being released from responsibility she'd never wanted in the first place. She'd spent 6 months becoming exactly what the kingdom needed: cold, ruthless, uncompromising, and in the end, the kingdom had rejected her anyway because people preferred familiar weakness over unfamiliar strength. Maybe they were right. Maybe Trent's coup would stabilize things in ways her competence never could. Maybe Adrian would rise to the occasion now that she wasn't there to cover his weaknesses. Maybe the kingdom would thrive under military oversight and traditional gender roles and all the comfortable hierarchies she'd shattered. Or maybe it would collapse under the weight of men who confused violence with leadership and authority with wisdom. Either way, it wasn't her problem anymore. The carriage stopped at an inn for the night. Evelyn was escorted to a small room, guards posted outside her door. She sat on the narrow bed and realized with strange clarity that this was the first time in 12 years she'd been truly alone. No attendants, no ministers, no husband or court or kingdom demanding her attention, just silence. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like the first full breath she'd taken since the morning she'd watched Adrian dance with Celine and understood her marriage was over. She'd lost everything: title, authority, the power she'd fought so hard to earn and harder to keep. But she'd also lost the burden of being responsible for millions of lives while knowing any mistake could cost thousands of deaths. Lost the weight of brutal choices and impossible decisions and the slow erosion of humanity that came with wielding absolute authority. In surrender, she'd found something Pemberton and Trent would never understand. Not defeat, release. The freedom that came from finally being allowed to stop being more than human when humanity was the only thing worth preserving. She fell asleep that night with moonlight streaming through a cracked window and the sound of guards changing shifts outside her door. No nightmares, no anxiety about tomorrow's crises, just deep, dreamless sleep of someone who'd finally been relieved of carrying a weight that was crushing her into something she hated. The woman who woke the next morning wasn't a queen, wasn't a ruler, wasn't the tyrant Pemberton feared or the savior Adrian had needed, just Evelyn Carter. Survivor of everything that should have destroyed her, heading toward exile that felt less like punishment and more like the only ending that made sense. Because this was what happened to women who dared reach for power men insisted was never meant for them. You either broke trying to hold it or learned to let go before it broke you completely. She'd chosen the latter. And if that made her weak in the eyes of people who measured strength by how long you could endure suffering, then so be it. She knew the truth. Surrender took more courage than standing. Letting go required more strength than holding on. And sometimes the bravest thing you could do was admit when the fight was over and walking away was the only victory worth claiming. The carriage rolled south toward exile, and Evelyn never looked back. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. Find resources. The estate in the southern provinces was smaller than Evelyn expected. Not a punishment exactly, just accurate. A modest stone manor surrounded by olive groves and hills that rolled away toward horizons she'd never bothered looking at when she was busy ruling an empire. The guards who'd escorted her south deposited her at the gates with instructions that were more warning than courtesy. Stay here. Stay silent. Stay forgotten. They left her standing in dust and sunlight with one trunk of belongings and the sudden vertigo of having nowhere to be and nothing to do for the first time in her adult life. The manor's caretaker was a woman named Sarah, weathered and suspicious, who showed Evelyn to rooms that were clean but bare. No luxury, no excess, just functional space for someone who'd been stripped of everything except breath and heartbeat. You'll get a stipend monthly, Sarah said, her voice flat. Enough to live modestly. Guards check in weekly to ensure you're complying with terms. Any attempt to leave the province or contact anyone in the capital results in immediate arrest. Understood. Sarah studied her with the blunt assessment of someone who'd seen nobility fall before and wasn't impressed by titles that no longer meant anything. You're younger than I expected, for someone who nearly tore a kingdom apart. I didn't tear it apart. Evelyn's voice was tired. I held it together. There's a difference. Is there? From where I'm standing, you're in exile and the kingdom is under military rule. Doesn't look much like success. It wasn't meant to be success. Just survival. Sarah snorted. Well, you survived. Question is whether that's enough. She left Evelyn alone in rooms that echoed with emptiness. The first night was the hardest. Not because of discomfort, but because of silence. No attendance, no ministers appearing with urgent matters, no Adrian's presence in adjacent chambers representing the shell of a marriage neither of them had known how to fix or abandon. Just Evelyn and the sound of wind through olive trees and the oppressive weight of having survived when part of her had expected to die defending the crown. She didn't sleep, just sat at the window watching stars wheel across unfamiliar sky and trying to figure out who she was when stripped of every role she'd spent 12 years performing. Not queen, not wife, not the ruthless survivor who'd sacrificed everything to maintain power she'd claimed was necessary. Just a woman in her mid-30s with nothing left except the memories of choices that had turned her into someone she wasn't sure she recognized anymore. The thing about falling from absolute power was discovering how much of your identity had been constructed from authority rather than selfhood. Without the crown, without the court, without the constant demands and crises, Evelyn found herself facing a stranger in the mirror. Someone who looked like her but felt hollowed out, scraped clean of purpose, left with only the raw edges of personality that had survived the transformation from dutiful queen to something harder and colder and infinitely more alone. Days blurred into weeks. She walked the estate grounds because staying still felt like suffocating. The olive groves became familiar. The hills held their shapes in her memory. She learned the names of birds she'd never noticed when she was busy managing an empire. Discovered that bread tasted different when you had time to actually notice flavor instead of eating mechanically between meetings. Found that sleep came easier when you weren't calculating threats and contingencies until 3 in the morning. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it felt like dying very slowly while still breathing. Sarah appeared one morning with letters. Evelyn's heart jumped before reality settled back in. Not from Adrian, not from anyone she'd known in her previous life, just administrative correspondence confirming her stipend and reminding her of exile conditions. Nothing from the capital, Sarah said, watching her face. Been 6 weeks. You'd think someone would write. They're not allowed to. Evelyn set the letters aside. And even if they were, what would they say? Sorry you saved the kingdom and got exiled for it? Hope your comfortable obscurity is treating you well? You're bitter. I'm realistic. The kingdom moved on the moment I surrendered. That's what kingdoms do. Individual people are replaceable, even queens, especially queens who forget their place. The barb landed, but Evelyn was too tired to react. Sarah was right. She'd forgotten her place. Or maybe she'd never known it to begin with. Had spent 12 years trying to be the perfect consort while secretly resenting the limitations, then 6 months proving she could rule better than the man she'd married, then lost everything because power accumulated by women was always seen as stolen rather than earned. The fundamental unfairness of it should have made her angrier. Instead, it just made her tired. You need to do something, Sarah said bluntly. Sitting around drowning in self-pity isn't going to change anything. What exactly do you suggest? I'm forbidden from politics, communication with the capital, or holding any position of authority. My options are limited. Then find options that aren't limited. Sarah gestured at the estate. The South Vineyard needs work. The northern wall has gaps. The village 3 miles down the road needs someone to teach children to read because the last teacher died and nobody's replaced him yet. You want purpose? It's everywhere, just not the kind you're used to. Evelyn started to argue, then stopped, recognizing truth even when it was delivered with the subtlety of a brick. She'd been waiting for meaning to find her instead of creating it, had assumed that without a crown in court, there was nothing worth doing. But that was just another lie power told, the idea that authority was the only thing that mattered, and everything else was beneath notice. The vineyard work was hard. Physical labor that left her hands blistered and muscles screaming. She'd never done manual work in her life, had people for that, servants who handled the dirty practical necessities while she managed affairs of state. Now she was those people. Pruning vines in the southern heat, hauling stones to repair walls, falling into bed each night too exhausted to think about everything she'd lost. The village school was worse. The children were suspicious of the strange woman from the north with soft hands and formal speech. They tested her constantly, pushing boundaries, seeing how far they could go before she broke. Evelyn recognized the behavior from court politics and responded the same way. Firm boundaries. Consistent consequences. Refusal to be intimidated by people who assumed her authority came from title rather than will. Within a month, the children were learning. Within 2 months, some of them were reading better than their parents. Within 3 months, Evelyn understood something she'd missed during 6 months of absolute power. Authority meant nothing without connection. You could force compliance through fear or position, but genuine influence required actually giving a damn about the people you were trying to reach. She'd ruled the kingdom without ever really seeing the people in it, had made decisions based on economics and strategy and political calculation, but never stopped to consider what those choices felt like to farmers and merchants, and children whose futures she was shaping with policies they had no voice in creating. It was a humbling realization, the kind that couldn't happen at the top of a hierarchy because distance made everyone below you look like chess pieces rather than humans. You needed to fall, to be stripped of power and comfort, before you could see clearly enough to recognize what you'd been missing. The letter from Adrian arrived 4 months into her exile. Not official correspondence, but personal, smuggled past guards by someone who'd risked punishment to ensure it reached her. Evelyn held the sealed envelope for 10 minutes before finding courage to break the wax. His handwriting was the same, precise and controlled. Every letter formed carefully, like he was afraid of making mistakes even on paper. The content was worse. He wrote about the kingdom, how Trent had installed military oversight on all major decisions, how the council now operated under constant supervision, how policies Evelyn had implemented were being quietly dismantled and replaced with traditional approaches that felt comfortable to men who'd never questioned whether comfortable was the same as effective. He wrote about missing her. Not romantically, he was clear about that. The marriage had died long before she went into exile. But missing her competence, her willingness to make hard choices, her refusal to accept that some problems couldn't be solved just because solving them required sacrifice. He wrote about regret, the affair with Celine, the weakness that had nearly destroyed everything, the abdication of responsibility that had forced Evelyn to become someone harder than she should have needed to be. He owned his failures in ways he'd never managed when she was standing beside him, and the honesty was devastating precisely because it came too late to matter. And at the end, a single question that cut deeper than any accusation. Was it worth it? Evelyn read the letter 3 times, then burned it in the fireplace because keeping evidence of communication from the capital was violation of exile terms. But the question lingered like smoke, settling into her thoughts and refusing to dissipate. Was it worth it? 6 months of absolute power. The transformation from patient queen to ruthless ruler. The choices that had saved the kingdom while destroying her marriage and eventually her position. The exile that followed when she'd chosen surrender over watching good people die defending authority she'd accumulated. She didn't know, couldn't know, because worth was measured by outcomes, and she was too close to see whether the kingdom was better or worse for her brief reign. Too invested in justifying choices that had cost everything to admit they might have been mistakes dressed as necessity. But walking through the village that afternoon, watching children practice reading under trees because the makeshift school had no walls, seeing farmers repair irrigation systems she'd helped design with knowledge earned from managing royal estates, Evelyn understood something that would have been impossible to grasp while holding power. Impact wasn't measured by how long you ruled or how much authority you wielded. It was measured by what remained after you were gone. The children who could read, the walls that stood, the systems that worked because someone had cared enough to build them properly, even knowing they'd never get credit. She'd spent 6 months trying to save a kingdom through policy and power. Now she was saving a village through presence and patience. The scale was different, but the principle was identical. Competence applied consistently over time, motivated by genuine care rather than political calculation. Maybe that was the answer to Adrian's question. It was worth it, not because she'd succeeded at holding power, but because the attempt had taught her what actually mattered. And losing everything had given her the humility to recognize that mattering didn't require a crown. Winter came to the southern provinces with cold rain and wind that stripped trees bare. Evelyn spent the season indoors more than she'd like, teaching children in the village hall and reading books she'd never had time for when she was managing a kingdom. Philosophy and history and poetry that spoke to human experiences beyond politics and power. She discovered authors who wrote about exile, about falling from grace, about learning to build identity from character rather than position. Their words felt like conversations with people who understood the strange grief of surviving when part of you expected to die with the role you'd lost. Sarah found her one evening reading by firelight, her face reflecting something the old woman hadn't seen before. Not contentment exactly, more like acceptance. The kind that comes from finally making peace with outcomes you can't change. You're different, Sarah observed, less sharp around the edges. I'm blunted. There's a difference. No, you're human. Before you were all edges, cutting everything that got close. Now you're something that can actually connect without drawing blood. Evelyn considered this. The transformation hadn't been intentional, just the natural consequence of being forced to live without armor, exposing vulnerability because pretending invincibility was exhausting when you had nothing left to protect. Power had made her dangerous. Exile was making her human again. Whether that was improvement or just different damage remained unclear. Spring arrived with new growth and the village celebrating some local festival Evelyn didn't understand the history of. She was invited because somewhere along the way she'd stopped being the exiled queen and become just Evelyn, the woman who fixed walls and taught children and didn't complain about circumstances that would have destroyed softer people. The celebration was simple. Food and music and people who laughed without calculation, no political maneuvering or strategic alliances, just humans enjoying brief respite from hard lives. Evelyn sat on the edge watching and feeling alien, her instincts still calibrated for court intrigue rather than genuine community. A child approached. One of her students, maybe 8 years old, with gap teeth and curious eyes. She held out a flower. For you, the girl said, because you're nice. I'm not nice. Evelyn's response was automatic. I'm practical. You can be both. The girl shoved the flower into Evelyn's hand and ran back to her friends, leaving the former queen holding a wildflower and feeling something crack in her chest that had been frozen since Trent's soldiers surrounded the palace. Nice. She'd spent 6 months being competent, ruthless, effective. Everything except nice. Because nice was weakness, and weakness got you destroyed. But this child who had no idea about crowns or kingdoms or the brutal choices power required saw something in Evelyn that she'd stopped recognizing in herself. The capacity to care without calculation. To be kind, not because it served strategy, but because kindness was its own justification. To build relationships that weren't transactions. That night, alone in the manor, Evelyn finally cried. Not for the power she'd lost, or the marriage that had died, or the kingdom that had forgotten her. But for the woman she'd been before Adrian's affair, before Celine's manipulation, before the desperate scramble to survive that had turned her into something cold and cutting and incapable of accepting a child's flower without suspicion. That woman was gone. Destroyed by betrayal and reconstructed into someone harder. But maybe the reconstruction didn't have to be permanent. Maybe given enough time and enough distance from the circumstances that had required brutality, she could recover pieces of humanity she'd traded for survival. The thought was terrifying and hopeful in equal measure. The second letter from Adrian arrived in early summer. Smuggled again, risking punishment for both sender and recipient. Evelyn almost didn't open it, afraid of what fresh crisis or impossible question it would contain, but curiosity won over caution. This letter was shorter, more urgent. Adrian wrote that Trent's military oversight was collapsing into dictatorship, that policies designed to restore stability were instead creating oppression, that the kingdom was sliding toward something darker than anything Evelyn had contemplated during her brief reign. He wrote that people were starting to remember her differently, not as the tyrant who'd seized power, but as the queen who'd held the kingdom together during crisis and surrendered rather than watch it burn. Ballads were being written, stories spreading through common folk about the people's queen who'd been driven out by generals afraid of capable women. He wrote that he'd been wrong, about surrender, about exile, about everything, that removing Evelyn hadn't restored balance, but exposed how much the kingdom had depended on her competence. And now it was falling apart without her. He begged her to come back. Not for him, not for their dead marriage, but for the kingdom that was discovering too late what it had lost when it chose comfortable tradition over uncomfortable excellence. Evelyn read the letter twice, then set it aside, her hands shaking not with anger, but with something more complicated. Vindication mixed with grief. Satisfaction that she'd been right mixed with sorrow at the cost of being proven correct. And underneath it all, the cold recognition that Adrian was asking her to sacrifice herself again for a kingdom that would probably just exile her again the moment she became inconvenient. She spent 3 days thinking, walking the estate grounds, teaching children who had no idea their teacher was weighing whether to abandon them for abstract duty to people who'd already rejected her once, Talking to Sarah, who listened without judgment and offered perspective from someone who'd never held power and thus understood its limitations better than anyone who had. On the fourth day, Evelyn wrote her response. Not to Adrian, but to herself, because some decisions required articulation even when no one else would read them. She wrote about the cost of power, how it demanded everything and gave back only the bitter satisfaction of knowing you'd done what was necessary even when necessary destroyed you. How holding authority meant making choices that haunted you forever, while people who'd never faced those decisions judged your character from safe distance. She wrote about the kingdom, how she'd loved it more than she'd loved Adrian, more than she'd loved herself, enough to become someone she hated if it meant keeping people alive. How that love had been unrequited because kingdoms were abstractions that couldn't love back, just consumed loyalty and spit out broken people when they'd outlived usefulness. She wrote about what she'd learned in exile. That impact didn't require authority. That meaning could be found in small acts repeated consistently rather than grand gestures made from positions of power. That the children she was teaching to read mattered just as much as policies that affected millions. Maybe more because she could see their faces and know their names and watch them grow in ways that were impossible when managing abstract populations. And she wrote her answer to Adrian's plea, simple and final. No. Not because the kingdom didn't need her, maybe it did, but because she needed something more than being needed. She needed to recover the parts of herself that power had consumed, needed to learn how to care without calculating, needed to discover who Evelyn Carter was when stripped of every role and title and expectation. The kingdom would survive, or it wouldn't. Either way, her sacrificing herself again wouldn't fix fundamental problems, wouldn't address the reality that systems dependent on single individuals were broken by design, wouldn't teach people that competent leadership could come from anyone if they valued capability over tradition. Someone else would have to save the kingdom this time. She was done burning herself to keep others warm. She sent no reply to Adrian, just burned his letter like she'd burned the first, letting smoke carry away his expectations and her obligation to meet them. The choice should have felt harder. Instead, it just felt like finally exhaling after holding breath for months. Sarah found her in the vineyard that afternoon, working the soil with blistered hands that were starting to callous into something more practical than ornamental. "You're staying then," the old woman said. "I'm staying. No regrets?" "Thousands." Evelyn didn't stop working, but fewer than I'd have if I went back. The kingdom needs you. The kingdom needs to learn. It can't depend on individuals to fix systemic problems. I'm not a solution. I'm a bandage, and bandages eventually need to be removed so the wound can actually heal. Sarah was quiet for a moment. "That's wiser than anything you said when you first arrived." Exile is educational. They worked in silence for a while, the rhythm of physical labor providing structure that didn't require words. Eventually, Sarah spoke again. "What will you do?" "Long term, I mean. Teaching and farming won't sustain you forever." "I don't know." Evelyn straightened, looking at the hills rolling away toward horizons. "Maybe that's the point. I spent 12 years being a queen and 6 months being a ruler. I've never just been myself. Maybe it's time to figure out what that means. And if being yourself isn't enough, then I'll learn to make it enough. Or I'll fail and discover that failure isn't death, just honesty about limitations." Sarah smiled, something rare and genuine. "You've changed. Not sure if it's for better or worse, but you've definitely changed. Give it another year. I'll let you know when I figure it out." Summer deepened into autumn. The children Evelyn taught started bringing her problems their parents faced, recognizing that the woman from the north understood systems and negotiations in ways that might help with disputes over land or resources. She mediated conflicts without authority, just competence and willingness to listen, and discovered that influence didn't require power when it was built on trust and genuine care. The village began to thrive in small ways. Better irrigation, resolved disputes, children learning skills that might lift them beyond subsistence. Nothing dramatic or worthy of historical record, just steady improvement that accumulated over time because someone was paying attention and working consistently toward better outcomes. It reminded Evelyn of managing a kingdom, except smaller, more personal, more satisfying because she could see direct results rather than trusting that policies would eventually filter down to actual humans. This was impact without power, change without authority. The kind of leadership that didn't require a crown because it was built from connection rather than hierarchy. She wrote no letters, sent no messages. Let the capital fade into memory like a fever dream that felt intense during but lost coherence with distance. That life belonged to someone else, a woman who'd been willing to sacrifice everything for abstract duty and discovered the sacrifice was never enough because hunger for power was infinite and feeding it only created demand for more. Winter returned, her second in exile. Evelyn spent it teaching children in the village hall and repairing walls damaged by storms and reading philosophy that spoke to the strange piece of learning to want what you had instead of constantly reaching for what you'd lost. On the anniversary of her exile, Sarah appeared with wine and 2 cups. They sat by the fireplace while rain hammered against windows and wind howled through gaps they'd need to fix come spring. "You ever regret it?" Sarah asked. "Giving up the crown?" "Every day." Evelyn's honesty had become easier with time, but I also don't regret it. Both things can be true. How does that work? I regret what I lost. The marriage that died. The power that felt like purpose. The belief that I was indispensable and the kingdom needed me specifically. She paused. But I don't regret choosing myself over continued sacrifice. Don't regret learning that my value isn't measured by how much I can endure. Don't regret discovering that quiet impact matters as much as grand gestures. So you're happy? No. But I'm becoming okay with not being happy. There's freedom in accepting that satisfaction doesn't require achievement or validation from others, that existence itself is sufficient without needing to justify it through constant productivity and self-sacrifice. Sarah raised her cup. To sufficiency, then. And to women who finally learned they don't owe the world everything. They drank in silence while fire crackled and wind raged, and somewhere far away a kingdom she'd once ruled continued spinning without her. Evelyn felt the absence of that connection like a phantom limb, present in its absence, but the pain was duller now, manageable, the kind of ache that reminded you what you'd survived rather than actively destroying you. Spring arrived again with new growth and a letter that changed everything. Not from Adrian this time, but from Marguerite, her voice coming through formal script with the peculiar clarity of someone who knew this might be their last communication. The old woman wrote that she was dying. Not quickly, but inevitably, the kind of slow fade that came with age and exhaustion. She wrote that she'd thought about Evelyn every day since the exile, wondered if the choice to surrender had been wisdom or just weariness, hoped that wherever the queen had gone, she'd found something worth the sacrifice. She wrote that the kingdom was struggling under Trent's military rule, but would survive, kingdoms always did, though the cost was measured in loss potential rather than dramatic collapse. That Adrian had grown into something resembling competent leadership, not brilliant, but steady, learning from failures even if the lessons came too late. And she wrote a request, not from queen to subject, but from one woman to another. Come say goodbye. Not to the capital, too dangerous and forbidden by exile terms, but to her family estate 3 days' ride from the southern provinces. One final meeting between people who'd survived impossible circumstances together, and deserved better endings than dying alone. Evelyn held the letter for hours, weighing obligation against self-preservation, connection against the hard-won peace of exile. Seeing Marguerite meant risking everything she'd built in isolation, meant confronting the person she'd been and measuring that against who she'd become, meant reopening wounds that had barely scarred over. But Marguerite had stayed loyal when everyone else had calculated odds and chosen self-interest, had followed Evelyn into exile in spirit even when physically separated, deserved the courtesy of presence during her final days, even if providing that presence cost everything. Evelyn left the next morning without telling Sarah where she was going or when she'd return, just packed minimal supplies and started walking north toward horizons she'd spent a year deliberately avoiding. The journey took 4 days of hard travel through terrain that tested endurance she'd rebuilt through physical labor but still wasn't prepared for. Marguerite's family estate was smaller than the palace, but infinitely more welcoming. The old woman was in bed, her body failing, but her mind sharp as ever. She smiled when Evelyn was shown into the room. "You came." Her voice was barely above whisper. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't." Evelyn sat beside the bed. "Coming here violates every term of my exile. If I'm caught..." "If you're caught, they'll imprison you. But you came anyway because you're still the woman who chose connection over safety." The old woman's smile widened slightly. "I'm glad exile didn't break that part of you. It broke everything else." "Good. You needed breaking. Marguerite's bluntness hadn't diminished with illness. You were becoming something terrible, competent and ruthless, and slowly losing track of why competence mattered. Exile saved you from turning into the tyrant Pemberton feared, by destroying everything I'd built, by forcing you to build something else, something better. Marguerite studied her with eyes that saw too much. Are you happy? No. But I'm learning to be sufficient. Then you're wiser than I ever managed. The old woman coughed, her body protesting the effort of conversation. Tell me about exile. The truth, not the version that protects your pride. So Evelyn talked about the estate and the village, about teaching children and fixing walls, about the strange peace of anonymity and the harder struggle of finding purpose without position, about learning that impact didn't require authority and that mattering was measured in small, consistent acts rather than grand, dramatic gestures. She talked about regret, the marriage that had died, the choices that had turned her into someone harder than necessary, the realization that holding absolute power had required becoming someone she wouldn't have liked if they'd met before the transformation. And she talked about acceptance, how exile had taught her that some things couldn't be fixed, only survived. That redemption wasn't earned through grand returns to power, but through quiet daily choices to care without calculation. That the rest of her life would be smaller than she'd once imagined, but might be richer for the reduction. Marguerite listened without interruption, her breathing shallow but steady. When Evelyn finished, the old woman was quiet for a long moment. You've grown, she said finally. Not older, though that too, but grown into someone who understands that strength isn't measured by how much you can carry, but by knowing when to set the burden down. I didn't set it down voluntarily. No, but you didn't pick it back up when given the chance. That's its own form of strength. They talked through the afternoon and into evening, not about kingdoms or politics or the grand sweep of history. Just two women who'd survived impossible circumstances sharing the quiet intimacy of understanding that came from walking similar paths. Marguerite died 3 days later, peacefully in her sleep. Evelyn stayed for the funeral, risking discovery because some obligations transcended caution. The service was small, attended by family who looked at the exiled queen with curiosity, but didn't question her presence. Grief provided its own authorization. Evelyn left immediately after, racing south before word of her violation could reach officials who'd enforce exile terms with imprisonment rather than gentleness. She made it back to the manor without incident, exhausted and grieving and somehow lighter for having honored connection despite risk. Sarah was waiting with arms crossed and expression unreadable. You're a fool. Going north violated every term. If you'd been caught, I wasn't, this time, but you rolled dice with your freedom because an old woman asked you to. Yes, Evelyn met her eyes steadily, and I'd do it again. Some things matter more than safety. The old caretaker's expression softened fractionally. You really have changed. The woman who arrived here a year ago would have calculated odds and chosen self-preservation. That woman was smart. That woman was coward, who called it wisdom. Sarah's voice was gentle. This woman is brave enough to risk what she's rebuilt for connection. That's worth something. Is it worth imprisonment if I'm caught? Probably not. But you'll never know because you're going to be careful from now on. Sarah paused. Right? Right. Liar. They both smiled, understanding passed between people who'd learned to read each other through proximity and shared experience. Evelyn returned to her routines with renewed appreciation for their simplicity. Teaching children, working the land, mediating village disputes, the small, consistent acts that accumulated into lives well lived, even if history never noticed. Years passed. Not dramatically, but steadily, one season bleeding into the next with the rhythmic certainty of natural cycles. Evelyn aged into her late 30s and then early 40s, her hands permanently calloused, her face weathered by sun and work, her body harder from physical labor than it had ever been from managing a kingdom. The village grew. Children she'd taught became young adults pursuing opportunities their education had opened. The systems she'd helped design continued functioning because they'd been built soundly rather than quickly. Her reputation spread to neighboring villages as someone who solved problems through competence rather than authority, and people started seeking her counsel on matters ranging from irrigation to dispute resolution. She never returned to the capital, never contacted Adrian, never tried to reclaim anything she'd lost during the 6 months of absolute power and catastrophic fall. That life belonged to someone else, a woman who'd believed competence and ruthlessness were sufficient and learned too late that they were necessary, but not sufficient. That leadership required connection. That authority without care created compliance, but never commitment. The woman she'd become understood these things in ways the queen never could have. Understood them because exile had stripped away everything except the fundamental question of what mattered when power and position were gone. And the answer, discovered slowly through years of small choices, was simpler than she'd ever imagined while ruling an empire. Connection mattered. Care mattered. The daily decision to show up and try again despite failure and fatigue, and the knowledge that your impact was limited and local rather than grand and historical. These were the things that made life worth living when all the external validation and achievement had been stripped away. A decade after her exile, a young woman appeared at the estate asking for Evelyn by name. She was maybe 20, with Adrian's eyes and features that suggested noble birth tempered by practical living. "I'm Catherine," she said, "the king's daughter by his second marriage. He sent me to find you." Evelyn felt something twist in her chest. Adrian had remarried. Of course he had. Kings needed heirs and political alliances, and the first marriage had produced no children, just mutual destruction and exile. She shouldn't have been surprised or hurt, but emotions didn't follow rational rules. "What does he want?" Evelyn asked, her voice carefully neutral. "To apologize." Catherine's expression was earnest. "He's dying. Illness that's taken months to kill him, but will finish the job soon. And before he goes, he wanted me to find you and tell you something he never managed to say properly, which is that you saved him. Not the kingdom, though you did that too, but him. By becoming what was necessary when he couldn't, by making impossible choices so he didn't have to, by surrendering when standing would have gotten people killed." She paused. "He says you were the strongest person he ever knew, and the kingdom never deserved you." Evelyn felt tears threatening, but forced them back through sheer will. "Tell him I said thank you for finally understanding, and that I forgive him, not because he deserves it, but because holding anger is exhausting, and I'm tired of carrying weights that don't serve me. He hoped you'd come back." Catherine's voice was gentle. "Not to rule, he knows that's impossible, but to say goodbye. No." The refusal was immediate and final. "He gets to die in peace knowing I forgive him, but I don't need to witness his ending to complete my own story. Some goodbyes are better left unspoken." Catherine looked disappointed but unsurprised, as if she'd expected this response. Before she left, she handed Evelyn a sealed letter. "He wrote this 10 years ago, right after you went into exile, but never sent it because he didn't have the courage until now." Evelyn took the letter but didn't open it until after Catherine had left, and the sun was setting over hills she'd learned to call home. Adrian's handwriting was shakier than she remembered, as if illness had stolen steadiness from even his script. He wrote about love. Not the passionate, consuming kind from their early marriage, but something quieter and more durable. The recognition that she'd been his partner in ways he'd never acknowledged. His strength when he was weak, his conscience when he'd been ready to compromise everything for temporary comfort. He wrote that Celine had been a symptom, not a cause, the affair born from his own inadequacy rather than Evelyn's failure. He wrote about regret, not just for the affair, but for every choice that had forced her to become harder than necessary, for abdicating responsibility and leaving her to carry weight that should have been shared, for letting her fall alone when his weakness had created the circumstances requiring her ruthlessness. And he wrote about respect, how watching her rule had shown him what true leadership required. Not authority, but competence. Not power, but care. Not ruthlessness, but willingness to make brutal choices in service of something larger than personal comfort. He'd spent 10 years trying to embody those principles and failing repeatedly, each failure teaching him how difficult it was to be what she'd made look effortless. The letter ended with simple words that hit harder than elaborate apology. "You were always enough. I was the one who was insufficient, and I'm sorry I couldn't tell you that when it mattered." Evelyn read the letter 3 times, then burned it like she'd burned all the others, letting smoke carry away Adrian's words into air that had absorbed so many confessions and regrets over the years. She felt something release in her chest, not forgiveness exactly because she'd already chosen that, but closure. The final acknowledgement that what they'd been to each other was complete, finished, over in ways that didn't require dramatic reconciliation or final confrontations. They'd both survived the crucible of power and betrayal. Both emerged changed and scarred and trying to build something meaningful from the ruins. That was enough. It had to be enough. Adrian died 3 months later. News reached the southern provinces through normal channels. Not dramatic announcements, but quiet acknowledgement that a king had ended and succession had occurred peacefully. Catherine became queen with her mother as regent. The kingdom continued spinning like it always did, consuming individuals and spitting out history, while actual humans tried to make meaning in the spaces between grand events. Evelyn felt his death like distant thunder. Present, but not threatening. Sad, but not devastating. They'd already said their goodbyes years ago when she'd chosen exile over power, and he'd learned to rule without her. The physical ending was just formality. She returned to teaching children in the village, working the estate grounds, mediating disputes between neighbors who'd learned she could be trusted to be fair, even when fairness meant telling people things they didn't want to hear. Her life continued in its small, consistent patterns, and she discovered with some surprise that she preferred this to the grand sweep of managing kingdoms. Because this was real, tangible, people she could know by name and care about individually rather than abstractly. Impact she could see with her own eyes rather than trusting reports from distant administrators. A life built from connection and competence rather than power and position. Years continued passing. Evelyn aged into her 50s, her hair going silver, her body slowing but still strong from decades of physical work. The village she'd helped build was thriving. Children she'd taught were now teaching their own children. Systems she'd helped design continued functioning smoothly. Her impact was lasting not because she'd held power, but because she'd built with care. On her 60th birthday, Sarah appeared with wine and news. Queen Catherine had quietly lifted the exile order as one of her first acts of clemency. Evelyn was free to return to the capital if she chose, free to reclaim titles and position and whatever remnants of her old life remained after 2 decades. The news should have been significant, world-changing. Instead, it just felt like paperwork catching up to reality she'd already accepted. "Are you going back?" Sarah asked. "No." Evelyn's response was immediate. "There's nothing for me there. The woman who ruled that kingdom died 20 years ago. I'm someone else now. Who are you then?" Evelyn considered the question seriously. "I'm a teacher who works in vineyards and mediates village disputes and has learned that mattering doesn't require a crown. I'm someone who survived losing everything and discovered that everything wasn't actually everything. I'm free." From what? From the belief that my value was measured by achievement or position or how much suffering I could endure. From the idea that sacrifice was its own virtue instead of just cost. From needing external validation to justify existence. She paused. "I'm finally free to just be sufficient." They drank wine and watched sunset paint hills in colors that never stopped being beautiful, no matter how many times you witnessed them. In the distance, children played games that had been passed down for generations. Somewhere far away, a kingdom continued spinning with problems that would be solved, or wouldn't, by people who'd never know her name. And here, in the small space she'd carved from exile and loss, and the hard work of rebuilding identity from nothing, Evelyn Carter had finally found what power never provided. Peace. Not the absence of struggle, but the acceptance that struggle was inherent and manageable. That suffering wasn't proof of strength, but just suffering. That the rest of her life would be smaller than she'd once imagined, but richer for the reduction. She'd been a queen who'd ruled absolutely and fallen completely. Now she was just a woman who'd learned that falling taught lessons power never could. That exile was sometimes liberation. That losing everything was the only way to discover what was worth keeping. History would forget her, or remember her as a cautionary tale. Either way, she'd survived, transformed, became someone who understood that true strength wasn't measured by how much power you could seize, but by how much humanity you could maintain while holding it. And in the end, that was enough. Not triumph, but sufficiency. Not victory, but survival with wisdom earned through decades of small choices made consistently in service of connection and care rather than authority and achievement. The sun set behind hills she'd walked for 20 years. The wind carried sounds of village life continuing in its timeless patterns. And Evelyn Carter, former Queen of Valadorn, finally allowed herself to stop carrying the weight of what she'd lost and simply exist in what she'd found. Sufficient, free, And finally, after decades of transformation and exile, and the brutal education that came from losing everything, at peace with the woman she'd become,